Hello, 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 and welcome back to Rush to Judgment with Jessica. And I am Jessica. How are we doing? How is everybody on this fine, lovely day, evening, night, afternoon, wherever it is you are coming from? Well, we are going to get right back into day 8. So this is day 8 of the Chandler Halderson trial. He is on trial for the murder of his mom and dad. And so far we've heard from lots of different people. And right now we're in the phases of like DNA analysis and crime scene analysis and things of that nature. So yeah, there's all of that. Day 8 is kind of in the videos that are available. They're kind of scattered, so hopefully I'm getting it all in there. But if not, we get the idea of what is going on. So yeah. And if you are not caught up and would like to be, you can go back through and watch all the rest of the videos that are up. I've gone through all of the days leading up to today and now. There is, however, if you notice, there is no day 7. There was a short day 7 of the judge bringing the jury in and letting everybody know that Mr. Halderson had come down with the vid and that they were going to have to be quarantined for a little bit of time. And in real time, in the trial time, they had to take a break in order for him to be quarantined and others to be quarantined according to CDC regulations and whatnot in that given time. But since we are not following it at that time, we get to just move right along through it. So since that is the case, we're going to move right into this one. And this is more of day 8. Yeah. So, and again, I'm not an expert. I'm not a legal expert. I'm not a lawyer. I have no real education in law. I simply watch the trials and have questions and really just kind of talk to myself and ask the questions that maybe, regular people ask. So that doesn't mean I necessarily have answers to these questions, but, thought maybe others might have the same and, watch along with me. And that'd be cool too. So, and, sometimes I have interesting things to say. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. And there you go. So, like, comment, subscribe. Just mostly like, comment, subscribe. Let's get my channel up and popping, y'all. So, yeah. Oh, I keep kicking the camera. Okay, let's get into it.
The blowers have turned on and they create a good deal of noise in the
Is this
courtroom.
better? Okay.
Doctor, do you hold any postgraduate degrees?
I do.
Could you please talk about those?
Sure. So I have a master's in forensic anthropology at Texas State University.
This is the
at that university. They do have
anthropologist
the largest
lady.
decomposition research facilities in the country.
And there was no, she just
I also hold
She
a
just
PhD,
kind of
again, in
went into it. There was no, the video just started with her talking. So we didn't miss anything. She's just talking about her credentials and all of that. So
For your work and your postgraduate degrees, I imagine there's a good deal of academic study in the classroom, but also a good deal of practical study in the field.
It is correct.
And,
Yes.
and you use the phrase body farms. Could you tell us, essentially, in your profession as an anthropologist, how does one learn to do the work practically that they have to do in their career?
Sure. So pretty much, we focus on three things. One is the search and recovery of human remains. So that's where the body farm comes into place, right? So that you can learn how to search for, recover the remains. And then once the remains are located, pretty much that's where the second thing comes in, which is the analysis, right? So one of the main things that we are focused on doing is trying to identify human remains, right? Whenever they're unidentified. So at the facility, once the individuals are pretty much done with decomposition, the skeleton itself is a valuable part of the research, right? In order for us to create new methods for identification, right? So whenever we have unknown human remains, we can actually estimate the age of the individual, the stature, the biological sex of the individual, as well as the ancestral background, or what we usually call race. Usually, once we get that profile or that information from the bones, we can usually give that to law enforcement or the medical examiner in order to narrow it down and help with identification. The third thing that we do is focusing on trauma analysis, right? Once we search, once we recover, once we identified, then we look for trauma. Our main goal is to A, identify the type of trauma that it is. Second, to locate where is the trauma located in the body. And third, mostly trying to figure it out how that trauma had something to do with the cause and the manner of death. So those are kind of a summary of the three things that we do and how the facility actually helps us getting that training.
Sure. And when we talk about human remains and the practical part of your education and getting your master's and your PhD, are these actual human remains that you're studying?
Yes. So both skeletal collections and both research facilities, they're donated remains. So individuals, once they're alive, they decided to donate their bodies to science, or usually the next of kin can actually donate their bodies to science as well.
After receiving your PhD in biological anthropology, could you just talk through what your career progression has been, where you've worked and what you've done?
Sure. So once I was almost done with my PhD, I actually started a position at the Waukesha County Medical Examiner's Office. I was in a dual position as their forensic anthropologist, as well as their deputy medical examiner. So there I spent about a little bit over 5 years. And then after that, I was hired here at the Dane County Medical Examiner's Office as their chief of investigations and also forensic anthropologist.
Aside from this case, what types of deaths or crime scenes are you often called upon to work on?
So especially in Waukesha and also here, I had experience with motor vehicle accidents that engulf in flames, all the way to gunshot wounds to the head, gunshot wounds to the torso, pretty much search and recovery of remains as well. And that can be categorized into a very secluded area, right, where the remains are undisturbed, all the way to areas where the remains have been disturbed. That could be from animal activity all the way to obviously human activity, right? In those regards, it's usually maybe because of a motor vehicle accident or because of fire trauma. So pretty much, I would say from all the spectrum to search and recovery to multiple cases of trauma as well.
Sure. You're not a medical doctor, correct?
I am not.
We've heard from multiple medical examiners, Dr. Rogalska and Dr. Breslauer in this case. Could you explain how your job as a forensic anthropologist is different from their job as a forensic pathologist, essentially?
Sure. So I always look at it as I work with the hard tissue and the pathologist focuses on the soft tissue, right? So I focus on the bone itself, right? But the soft tissue is very important to me, right? So that's why I have to work along with the pathologist, right? Because just to give you an example, if I see a bone still during autopsy and I see a potential fracture, I always like to look at the tissue because there might be hemorrhage there, right? So we kind of need to work together. I do not establish cause and manner of death. I actually provide information so that
I feel like Bones
can actually
did.
put it together, and from my information,
She could tell you how
get
they
an
died
estimated,
by the bones.
guess about the cause and manner of death. So my focus is on the bone itself, right? And we go back again to the
Just saying.
identification process and the trauma analysis. How that information is actually going to help the pathologist determine who this person is, and then from there also determine and help with the cause and the manner of death.
Since graduating and beginning your career as an anthropologist, are you ever called upon to teach or instruct law enforcement and other professionals, both at a state and national level, about what you do and the concept of forensic anthropology in general?
Yes. So I actually started that during my graduate career. So part of my graduate career involves teaching. So, and especially at Texas State and also the University of Knoxville, the Tennessee in Knoxville, because those facilities are actually used for training. So since my master program, I had to teach from search and recovery all the way to identification and trauma analysis to local law enforcement and to the FBI. The same with Tennessee. We have a program there where law enforcement from all over the country usually comes here for training. The same with the FBI as well. And also here in Wisconsin, I've been able to teach and train some of the local law enforcement in regards to search and recovery, as well as the identification process when we have unknown human remains.
Doctor, were you asked to become involved into the investigation of the homicides of Bart and Krista Halderson, and as well as obviously some remains or bone fragments found at home on Oak Springs in the town of Windsor?
I was.
And you performed quite a bit of work on this, did you not?
I did.
You have written 4 separate reports.
I did.
One involving Bart Halderson.
That's correct.
One involving Krista.
That's correct.
One involving the remains found near Krista that hadn't been DNA determined to be Krista, correct?
That's correct.
And then lastly, one regarding items found at the home on Oak Springs.
That is correct.
I'm showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 169. Is this a printout of the presentation that we've developed to try to present some of your testimony?
That's correct.
379 in that presentation.
That's correct.
All right, I'll move 569 and 379 and move to display 379.
No objection.
They are received.
Every case presents different questions for people at the medical examiner's office, and specifically for you. Every case presents different questions you're trying to answer. Correct?
That's correct. Yes.
And even today, as we go through the different sets of remains, at different times you're trying to answer different questions.
Yes.
All right. We're going to start with Bart Halderson. For the record, I'm showing you what's been marked as exhibit 375. Is that your report related to Mr. Halderson?
That is correct.
Okay. I'll move 375 into evidence.
No objection.
It is received. It may be published.
When it comes to Bart Halderson, you weren't necessarily trying to identify who he was. That was established already, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What questions were you trying to answer when it comes to Bart Halderson?
So in this case, the main question was because there was trauma. There was sharp force trauma to the bone. So in the setting of a potential dismemberment, the goal of this examination was to trying to provide information about the class characteristics of the tools that were potentially used for the dismemberment.
Sure. So if we go to the first slide, it talks about the beginning of your involvement. Just tell me how you became involved in the study of Mr. Bart Halderson's dismemberment.
Sure. So pretty much once the autopsy was completed and the individual was positively identified, again, due to the presence of sharp force trauma, I was in the setting of a potential dismemberment. I was called and ordered to examine the human remains, again, because of the trauma analysis and the potential goal for getting an anthropological tool mark analysis that can provide information about the classifications of the properties of the tools that were potentially used in this setting.
When you use the phrase anthropological tool mark analysis, what do you mean by that? What are you trying to determine?
Sure. So anthropological tool mark analysis focuses on the characteristics, right? On the characteristics that were left on the bone and how those characteristics actually are similar or dissimilar to any other tool or potential characteristics of other tools that were found near the decedent or anything that is of potential evidence.
Could you tell me a little bit about the general condition of the remains when you had access to them?
Sure. Specifically for the decedent, there was a lot of changes, especially on the torso. There was marbling, there was skin slippage, there was maggot activity. So pretty much once the autopsy was completed, Dr. Corey Berslauer was the one who actually dissected the elements that were needed for analysis. Once the elements were dissected, the elements were macerated in water, which is just pretty much cleaning in water. And then after that, they were dried for about 2 weeks. The elements that were removed from the body that had dismemberment trauma were pretty much both arms and both femur or the legs.
When the last bullet point there, you say each element was macerated in water and air dried. Throughout this presentation, the jury's looked at a lot of photographs in this case. We're not going to look at any photographs of the body being decomposed or anything of that sort, correct? We're going to look at
That
bones.
is correct, yes.
There are photographs of bones, and these are, in fact, the bones of Bart Halderson we're going to look at.
That's correct.
Okay. After you were able to take a look at those bones, you perform what's called a skeletal inventory?
Right.
Skeletal inventory.
Much for just what out, right? So in order to determine, I want to look for features, and I want to make sure that a single individual, and B, that all the elements that I'm looking for, that I need for the analysis, are present.
Sure. So we'll start here. And just to clarify, those are in fact Mr. Halderson's bones we're looking at?
Yes.
Okay. And we have an example, obviously, a skeleton on the right showing us the location, but tell the jury what we're looking at here.
Sure. So right now we're looking at the 4th, fifth, sixth, and seventh cervical vertebrae. So cervical vertebrae is pretty much what makes your neck, right? So that is the reason why I put that in there, so that you guys can get an idea of what section we're looking at. Like I said, it's for all the way from the fourth all the way to the seventh. Below the seventh, that's when your thoracic vertebrae starts. So it's pretty much almost at the bottom of the neck.
In counting the vertebrae, we start at the top with 1 and then we go down, correct? So the fourth there is the highest one?
Yeah, so pretty much we have skull, and then from the skull we have 1, 2, and 3, and then from 3 all the way to 7, that's what makes up your neck.
And are these the only are these the top vertebrae that you were able to obtain from the torso?
Yes, those are the only cervical vertebrae that were available.
What are we looking at here?
So that's pretty much your arm. So it's the humerus. So we have the left humerus. And what I did is I show you different views, right? The front, the back, the side, the inside. And then we also have the right humerus. And again, I provided you with multiple views of it. The humerus is just pretty much your arm bone. So it's pretty much from the top of your shoulder all the way, almost maybe kind of halfway.
And on the left there is the left arm, and on the right is the right arm?
Yes.
Okay. And those are Mr. Halderson's bones?
That is correct.
Okay. What are we looking at here?
So now we're looking at the femur, or pretty much kind of the top part of the leg. Again, we have the left femur, and what I included is different views that you guys can see the front, the back, and the sides. And then we have the right femur. And again, I show you multiple views so that you guys can have a general overview of the element itself.
And you were able to make some observations fairly quickly about what was going on, or at least of some suspicions you had of how those limbs were severed?
Yes. So the first thing that I noticed is that there is dismemberment trauma on the skeleton, and it is consistent with transection via sawing. Pretty much when I'm doing an anthropological tomb-work analysis, I'm trying to focus on several things. One of them is false starts, also the distance between the teeth of progress of the blade, and also of the cutting stroke.
And for Mr. Halderson, we're going to go through these in some more detail just to teach everyone about what we're talking about, right? But we're not going to do that for everybody.
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about what is a false start.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So a false start is just a cut that did not go through, right? That it did not separate the bone completely. One of the reasons why I'm very interested in false starts is because it gives me a lot of information. The deeper the false start, the more information I'm going to get about the tool. One of them is the minimum curve, right? So the curve is just a fancy word for the walls, right? The walls of that false start. So the width, the minimum width of that false start is actually going to give me information about the width of the set of the blade, right? If you think about it, the knife goes through the bone. So whatever false start I have and whatever width I have is directly correlated with the width of that blade. So that's why it's so important. Again, the deeper it is, the more information I can get.
And an example, I think maybe you and I
Gets
talked
real
about
excited.
in December was I talked about
When
cutting
she
down my
likes what
Christmas
she
tree
does.
where I pushed the saw through and it got stuck and I pulled it out. That's a false start.
Yes, that is a good
Oh,
example of a false
God.
start.
Okay.
Yep. Sounds good, sir.
What do we mean when we talk about teeth per inch, and why is that important?
Sure. So in regards to teeth per inch, right, if we're thinking about tools, the type of tools that we're utilizing for whatever type of job you have, right, you're always, depending on the tool and the job, you always want to look for teeth per inch. So teeth per inch, the smaller the teeth per inch, the rougher the cut is going to be, right? If you're thinking about wood, if you have a higher teeth per inch, that is usually something that is going to give you a smoother cut. So that's just thinking in terms of, right, if you go to the hardware store and you're looking for, some type of job. In this case, teeth per inch is actually very informative for us as well, because it's a very unique characteristic of the tool itself. And that actually reflects on the bone itself. So as you're cutting through, depending on how many teeth per inch you have, it's going to create some grooves and some dips in the bone itself. So those dips and those grooves, we can actually measure them, and we can that distance is actually correlated again back to the teeth per inch. The measurement of the actual tool itself is very simple. You take the tool, you obviously put a scale, and then you count how many teeth you have within an inch, right? So the same is with the bone. I measure, and then from there, I actually calculate how many teeth per inch I have on that bone.
So we talked about the false starts. So we have a cut that didn't go all the way through. So from that cut, the width of the blade.
Yes.
And if you look inside the cut, you're saying you can see grooves that help you determine approximately teeth per inch.
That is correct.
We're going to talk a little bit today about breakaway notches and directions of blade progress. What do we mean by this, and what is this slide telling us?
Sure. So whenever you're cutting, right, we have the false start. Whenever we go all the way down, right, so we successfully cut whatever we need in 2 halves, sometimes we're going to get a breakaway notch or a spur. So a breakaway notch is just simply pretty much a projection of the bone in this case, right? So that projection is actually very important for me because it gives me some information. First, it gives me information about the energy or how much force used, right? So we usually try to say the smaller the breakaway notch or the smaller the breakaway spur, the less energy. And that's usually related to potentially a handsaw, right? If we are using something with more energy, right? If we're using a power-driven saw, that is going to give me a bigger breakaway notch, right? So it gives me a little bit of information about the type of energy. From the breakaway notch or the spur, we can also determine the direction. There's two types of directions here, right? And they're both very important. One is the blade progress. That is just simply telling me was the bone cut from front to back, from back to front. It's just pretty much the direction of the cut, right? The second thing is actually telling me the cutting stroke. So that's telling me, is the knife entering through the side, right? From the side and then ending all the way into the inside of it. So you would think, why is that important? Well, if the knife is entering through the side, that means the handle was on the side, right? So that gives me a little bit of information about position, right? How was that bone cut? So it is very important for me to determine the blade progress and also the cutting stroke, because it gives me information about, again, the mechanisms. How did this happen?
Okay, so we have the false starts, the width of the blade, the teeth per inch that you can see inside that false start, and now we're talking about something else, which is when it goes all the way through, what's that spur look like at the end? And you're saying you can gather something from that about the type of force used, essentially, in cutting through that bone.
That is correct.
Right. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is the classification of blades, the difference between a rip saw and a crosscut saw. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So these are kind of the most common ones, right? When we're talking about saws. So these are the classifications of the blade. This is also, again, very important because it's very unique to the bone, and it gives a very unique feature that we can look at and say, hey, this is mostly classified with a rip saw or mostly classified with a crosscut. And because these are so common, it is very informative when we're trying to classify and we're trying to find information about the potential tool that was used. For rip saws, they're very unique. Pretty much each tooth kind of chisels a bite out of whatever you're trying to cut, right? So in this case, it leaves a very unique mark. It leaves a very flat bottom and is almost squared, right? So I'm looking for that on the bone, especially on that breakaway notch, right? So as you're done cutting, that breakaway notch is going to give me that information. So we can look at the bottom and see if the bottom is flat and it looks squared, that is indicative of a rip saw. The opposite will be for a crosscut, right? So we're looking again at that breakaway notch. We're looking at the end of it. And if I see that it looks almost like a W, that is usually indicative of a crosscut. The reason for that is because the crosscut actually pretty much cuts with the grain, right? So it leaves that mark, a very unique W mark.
So let's start talking about Mr. Halderson, using all of those tools in our tool belt in terms of what we're looking at. Let's talk about the top cervical vertebrae where Mr. Halderson appears to have been beheaded at some point. Could you talk about what you were able to observe on that fourth cervical vertebrae?
Sure. So I only included the fourth cervical vertebrae because that was the only one that actually had dismemberment trauma, right? The fourth cervical vertebrae, I don't know if you noticed on the other photos, it seems like this one is a little bit different. The reason for that is because we're missing the top, right? So if you can see, most of the inside of the bone looks very brittle, almost like a sponge. So that is actually the inside of the bone. Inside of that bone, you need like a top, like a cap. That cap is missing, right? So that tells me that at some point there was some transection or some pretty much dissection or dismemberment of that area. False starts, none were identified. One of the reasons for that is because of the type of bone that we have, right? You're seeing that it almost looks like a sponge. Those don't record the characteristics of the tool very well, right? So usually on more long bones, we will record a better characteristics, but usually on these, what we call irregular bones,
that he was
the false
stuffing and
starts are
starting
not
on
as
those.
common. The direction of blade, again, and the direction of cutting stroke was not, I was not able to
Jesus.
identify it, again, because of the type of bone that we're using here. However, we were able to identify teeth per inch. So if you're looking at the bone, all the see that there's a groove there, those actually gave me a measurement of 4.5 teeth per inch.
And so everyone's clear, at the end of going through all of the different limbs that were severed, we're going to talk holistically with a table, talk about what these measurements look like together.
Yeah, we will put them together so that everybody can understand.
All right, and we'll move on to the dismemberment of the right humerus.
Yep, so we're looking again at the right arm. So we have a full view, which is the front, and then I'm also showing you kind of the inside. So medial is just pretty much kind of towards the center of the body. So first of all, I'm looking for false starts. And the right proximal had 4 cut marks that are consistent with false starts.
Were you able to determine blade progress and cutting stroke?
Yes, so the blade progress in this case was from back to front. And also the cutting stroke pretty much started on the medial, right? So it was from the inside, cutting all the way to the outside, right? So from back to front and from inside to outside. Another thing that I noticed is that now I'm looking at pretty much the whole area that was cut. In that whole area, I noticed that there was non-uniform striations. So pretty much they were all over the place. And indicating that there was a reciprocating action, right? So if you're cutting back and forth, and it's also with a straight blade. The reason why it's a straight blade is because the striations were straight, right? They were not circular.
And perhaps here we're getting a pretty good look at what you meant by
So
the spur.
graphic.
Yes, so you can actually kind of see a little bit of the difference in the color. That is the breakaway notch. That breakaway notch is not very big.
I'll move 371 into evidence.
It is received, and I'll ask the witness to slide the microphone a lot closer because the blowers have turned on and they create a good deal of noise in there.
Doctor, do you hold any scan?
Oh my gosh.
I do. Sure. So I have a
What is
master's
happening?
in forensic anthropology at Texas State University. And saw that is going to give me a bigger breakaway notch, right? So it gives me a little bit of information about the type of smaller the teeth per inch.
You were able to make some observations fairly quickly about what was going on, or at least of some suspicion
Hold
about
on.
how those limbs were severed.
Yes. So the first thing that I noticed is
To clarify, those are in fact Mr.
Dr. Corey Breslauer was the one who actually
Selena's wrong. Well, they're fixing it on their own.
5. Is that your report related to Mr. Halderson?
that is correct.
I'll move 375 into evidence.
No objection.
It is received. It may be published.
When it comes to Bart Halderson, you weren't necessarily trying to identify who he was. That was established already, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What questions were you trying to answer when it comes to Bart Halderson?
So in this case, the main question was because there was trauma. There was sharp force trauma to the bone. So in the setting
wait,
of dismemberment,
with this one,
dismemberment,
we could have watched
the
all
goal
of the
this
things
examination
with
was
the
to
things.
trying to determine or trying to provide information about the type of the class characteristics of the tools that were potentially used for the
Oh, for-
dismemberment.
Sure. So if we go to the first slide, it talks about the beginning of
For
your
F's
involvement.
sake.
Tell me how you became involved in the study of Mr. Bart Halderson's dismemberment.
Sure. So pretty much once the autopsy was completed and the individual was positively identified, again, due to the presence of sharp force trauma, I was in the setting of a potential dismemberment. I was called in order to examine the human remains, again, because of the trauma analysis and the potential goal for getting an anthropological tool mark analysis that can provide information about the classifications of the properties of the tools that were potentially used in this.
Phrase anthropological tool mark analysis. What do you mean by that? What are you trying to determine?
Sure. So an anthropological tool mark analysis focuses on the characteristics, right? So I'm looking at the characteristics that were left on the bone and how those characteristics actually are
Well, this
similar
is
or dissimilar to
ridiculous.
any other tool or potential characteristics of other tools that were found we're looking at. Like I said, it's for all the way from the 4th all the way to the 7th. Below the 7th.
So this
that's
is
when
just all the
thoracic
pictures
vertebrae starts.
that we
So it's
weren't
pretty much
seeing
all the same.
before.
In
Now they
counting
have them
vertebrae, we
with
start at the top with
pictures,
1, and then we go down, correct?
like
So
they
4th there is the
were
highest
doing
one.
it.
Right? If you go to the hardware store and you're looking for, some type of job and saw, that is going to give me a bigger breakaway notch, right? So it gives me a little bit of information about the type of energy. From the breakaway notch or the spur, we can also determine the direction. There's 2 types of directions here, right? And they're both very important. One is the blade progress. That is
Where did
just
she
a
stop
breakaway
talking over
notch.
here?
We're looking at the end of it. And if I see that it looks almost like a W, that is usually indicative of a crosscut. The reason for that is because the crosscut actually pretty much cuts with the grain, right? So
Oh,
it leaves that
God.
mark, a very unique W mark.
Hold on. See what I mean? Well, you know what? We're just going to watch it all
Goal
because I can't
for
figure
getting
out
an
what is what and what is
anthropological
not.
toolmark analysis.
So
That can provide information about the
just
classifications
going
of
to
the
watch it
properties of the
all.
tools.
Whether
that
we
we're
watched
potentially
it or we
using.
didn't,
When
it
you
all
use the
sounds
phrase
different and it all
anthropological
sounds the
toolmark
same, but now there's
analysis,
pictures.
what do you mean by that? What are you trying to determine?
Sure. So an anthropological toolmark analysis focuses on the characteristics, right? So I'm looking at the characteristics that were left on the bone and how those characteristics actually are similar or dissimilar to any other tool or potential characteristics of other tools that were found near the decedent or anything that is a
Lay
potential
down.
evidence.
Could you tell me a little bit about the general condition of the remains when you had access to them?
Sure. Specifically for the decedent, there was a lot of changes, especially on the torso. There was marbling, there was skin slippage, there was maggot activity.
I remember
So
skin
pretty
slippage.
much once the autopsy was completed, Dr. Corey Breslauer was the one who actually dissected the elements that were needed for analysis. Once the elements were dissected, the elements were macerated in water, which is just pretty much cleaning in water. And then after that, they were dried for about 2 weeks. The elements that were removed from the body that had dismemberment trauma were pretty much both arms and both femur or the legs.
The last bullet point there, you say each element is
Remember
macerated
this.
in water and air dried. Throughout this presentation, the jury's looked at a lot of photographs in this case. We're not going to look at any photographs of the body being decomposed or anything of that sort. Correct? We're going to look at
That is
bones.
correct. Yes,
There are photographs of bones, and these are, in fact, the bones of Bart Halderson that we're going to look at.
that's correct.
After you were able to take a look at those bones, you performed something called a skeletal inventory.
See, this is what happens when you
So
do
pretty much
a
for me, I
live
just need to
reaction
know
to
what I
things,
have, right?
and
So
you
in order
don't
for me to
watch
start
the
my
videos
examination, I
prior
look for
to.
pictures, and I wanna make sure
So,
that I have
sorry,
elements
not
in
sorry,
the
but
and B, that
this
all the elements
is-
that
this
I'm
is
looking
live.
for,
This
for the
is-
analysis are present.
live, but
So
not
we'll start
live.
here. And
But
just
this
to clarify,
is-
those are in fact Mr. Halderson's bones we're looking at.
Yes.
You're watching
And we
it
have
with
an
me.
example, obviously, a skeleton on the right showing us the location, but tell the jury what we're looking at here.
Sure. So right now we're looking at the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th cervical vertebrae. So cervical vertebrae is pretty much what makes your neck, right? So that is the reason why I put that in there so that you guys can get an idea of what section we're looking at. Like I said, it's all the way from the 4th all the way to the 7th. Below the 7th, that's when your thoracic vertebrae starts. So it's pretty much almost at the bottom of the neck.
In counting the vertebrae, we start at the top with 1 and then go down, correct? So the 4th there is the highest one.
Yeah, so pretty much we have the skull, and then from the skull we have 1, 2, and 3, and then from 3 all the way to 7, that's what makes up your neck.
And are these the only vertebrae? Are these the top vertebrae that you were able to obtain from the torso?
Yes, those are the only cervical vertebrae that were available.
What are we looking at here?
So that's pretty much your arm. So it's the
We're
humerus.
not
So
there.
we have the left humerus, and what I did is I show you different views, right? The front, the back, the side, the inside, and then we also had the right humerus. And again, I provided you with multiple views of it. The humerus is just pretty much your arm bone. So it's pretty much from the top of your shoulder all the way, almost maybe kind of halfway.
And on the left there is the left arm, and on the right is the right arm.
Yes,
And those are Mr. Halderson's bones.
that is correct.
What are we looking at here?
So now we're looking at the femur, or pretty much kind of the top part of the leg. Again, we have the left femur, and what I included is
Where
different
your
views
hip
that you guys
bone.
can see the front, the back, and the sides. And then we have the right femur. And again, I show you multiple views so that you guys can have a general overview of the element itself.
So these are
you
just
were able
all
to
the
make some
bones that were
observations fairly
left.
quickly about what's going on, or at least
Or
the
that were
suspicions you had
sawed
as bones were
on.
severed.
Yes. So the first thing that I noticed is that there is dismemberment trauma on the skeleton, and it is consistent with transection via sawing. Pretty much when I'm doing an anthropological toolmark analysis, I'm trying to focus on several things. One of them is false starts, also the distance between the teeth of whatever tool we're using, and then also the direction of blade, direction of progress of the blade, and also of the cutting stroke.
And for Mr. Halderson, we're going to go through these in some more detail just to teach everyone about what we're talking about, right? But we're not
Sure.
going to do that for everybody.
Yes.
Let's talk about what is a false
For everybody,
start?
there's only one more.
Go ahead.
So a false start is just a cut that did not go through, right? That it did not separate the bone completely. One of the reasons why I'm very interested in false starts is because it gives me a lot of information. The deeper the false start, the more information I'm going to get about the tool. One of them is the minimum curve, right? So the curve is just a fancy word for the walls, right? The walls of that false start. So the width, the minimum width of that false start is actually going to give me information about the width of the set of the blade, right? If you think about it, the knife goes through the bone. So whatever false start I have and whatever width I have is directly correlated with the width of that blade. So that's why it's so important. Again, the deeper it is, the more information I can get.
And an example I think maybe you and I talked about in that meeting in December was I talked about cutting down my Christmas tree and where I pushed the saw through and it got stuck and I pulled it out. That's a false start.
Yes, that
I
is a good
remember
example of
that
false start.
analogy. Again, this
What do we mean
is
when we
just
talk
the
about
same thing that we
visualizing?
already heard,
Sure. So
just with
in regards to teeth
pictures.
per inch, right? If we're thinking about tools, the type of tools that we're utilizing for whatever type of job you have, right? You're always, depending on the tool and the job, you always want to look for teeth per inch. So teeth per inch, the the smaller the teeth per inch, the rougher the cut is going to be, right? If you're thinking about wood, if you have a higher teeth per inch, that is usually something that is going to give you a smoother cut. So that's just thinking in terms of, right, if you go to the hardware store and you're looking for, some type of job. In this case, teeth per inch is actually very informative for us as well, because it's a very unique characteristic of the tool itself. And that actually reflects on the bone itself. So as you're cutting through, depending on how many teeth per inch you have, it's going to create some grooves and some dips in the bone itself. So those dips and those grooves, we can actually measure them, and we can that distance is actually correlated again back to the teeth per inch. The measurement of the actual tool itself is very simple. You take the tool, you obviously put a scale, and then you count how many teeth you have within an inch, right? So the same is with the bone. I measure, and then from there, I actually calculate how many teeth per inch I have on that bone.
So we talked about the false starts. So we have a cut that didn't go all the way through. So from that cut, you know the width of the blade.
Yes.
And if you look inside the cut, you're saying you can see grooves that help you determine approximately teeth per inch.
That is correct.
We're going to talk a little bit today about breakaway notches and directions of blade progress. What do we mean by this, and what is this slide telling us?
Sure. So whenever you're cutting, right, we have the false start. Whenever we go all the way down, right, so we successfully cut whatever we need in 2 halves, sometimes we're going to get a breakaway notch or a spur. So a breakaway notch is just simply pretty much a projection of the bone in this case, right? So that projection is actually very important for me because it gives me some information. First, it gives me information about the energy or how much force was used, right? So we usually try to say the smaller the breakaway notch or the smaller the breakaway spur, the less energy. And that's usually related to potentially a handsaw, right? If we are using something with more energy, right? If we're using a power-driven saw, that is going to give me a bigger breakaway notch, right? So it gives me a little bit of information about the type of energy. From the breakaway notch or the spur, we can also determine the direction. There's 2 types of directions here, right? And they're both very important. One is the blade progress. That is just simply telling me was the bone cut from front to back, from back to front. It's just pretty much the direction of the cut, right? The second thing is actually telling me the cutting stroke. So that's telling me, is the knife entering through the side, right, from the side, and then ending all the way into the inside of it? So you would think, why is that important? Well, if the knife is entering through the side, that means the handle was on the side, right? So that gives me a little bit of information about precision, right? How was that bone cut? So it is very important for me to determine the blade progress and also the cutting stroke because it gives me information about, again, the mechanisms. How did this happen?
Okay. So we have the false starts, the width of the blade, the teeth per inch that you can see inside that false start, and now we're talking about something else, which is when it goes all the way through, what's that spur look like at the end? And you're saying you can gather something from that about the type of force used, essentially, in cutting through that bone.
That's correct.
And then the last thing we're going to talk about is the classification of blades, the difference between a rip saw and a crosscut saw. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So these are kind of the most common ones, right, when we're talking about saws. So these are the classifications of the blade. This is also, again, very important because it's very unique to the bone, and it gives a very unique feature that we can look at and say, hey, this is mostly classified with a rip saw or mostly classified with a crosscut. And because these are so common, it is very informative when we're trying to classify and we're trying to find information about the potential tool that was used. For rip saws, they're very unique. Pretty much each tooth kind of chisels a bite out of whatever you're trying to cut, right? So in this case, it leaves a very unique mark. It leaves a very flat bottom and is almost squared, right? So I'm looking for that on the bone, especially on that breakaway notch, right? So as you're done cutting, that breakaway notch is going to give me that information. So we can look at the bottom and see if the bottom is flat and it looks squared, that is indicative of a rip saw. The opposite will be for a crosscut, right? So we're looking again at that breakaway notch. We're looking at the end of it. And if I see that it looks almost like a W, that is usually indicative of a crosscut. The reason for that is because the crosscut actually pretty much cuts with the grain, right? So it leaves that mark, a very unique W mark.
So let's start talking about Mr. Halderson, using all of those tools in our tool belt in terms of what we're looking at. Let's talk about the top cervical vertebrae, where Mr. Halderson appears to have been beheaded at some point. Could you talk about
soft bone again?
Cervical vertebrae?
Sure. So I only included the 4th cervical vertebrae because that was the only one that actually had dismemberment trauma, right? The 4th cervical vertebrae, I don't know if you noticed on the other photos, it seems like this one is a little bit different. The reason for that is because we're missing the top, right? So if you can see, most of the inside of the bone looks very brittle, almost like a sponge. So pretty much they were all over the place, and indicating that there was a reciprocating action, right? So if you're cutting back and forth, and it's also with a straight blade. The reason why it's a straight blade is because those striations were straight, right? They were not circular.
And perhaps here we're getting a pretty good look at what you meant by the spur at the bottom.
Yes, so you can actually kind of see a little bit of the difference in the color. That is the breakaway notch. That breakaway notch is not very big, and we will go over and you will see some of the characteristics that I was talking about, some of the features that we were talking about.
Sure. Sticking with the same bone, were you able to determine teeth per inch that was used in whatever instrument was used to dismember this body part?
Yes, so I was able again to look at the area that was cut, and there were several areas where you can see bumps and kind of grooves. So those bumps were measured. Here I'm showing you just one so that you guys can get an idea of how it is. And overall, the teeth per inch were 20 to 14.3 teeth per inch in this particular bone.
Again, sticking with the right arm, were you able to determine the saw set width?
Yes. So again, going back to that breakaway spur, in this breakaway spur, you can see on that little red square that that end is flat bottom and is squared, right? So that's when the blade goes all the way down, it hits that point, right? So that's where it breaks, right?
Okay,
so that area
we get
where it's
it.
flat bottom,
He was
square,
taken
which is
apart.
indicative of
He
a
was
ripsaw.
cut apart.
Let's
Now
talk about
tell
the
me-
left arm, the left humerus. Talk to me about
Tell
the
me
false
what
starts
this
and
boy's
the-
defense is.
Sure. So on this one,
It
we do have a
wasn't
little bit
me.
more false starts.
Is he gonna have
so
the
we have about
shaggy
11
defense?
cut marks that are consistent with a false start.
Wasn't me.
Were you able to determine
Nose
blade progress
goes.
and cutting stroke direction?
Wasn't
Sure.
me.
So on this one, pretty much the cut was made from back to front. And the cutting stroke was pretty much from the lateral, so from the outside all the way to the inside. So the
Like,
cutting
what is the
motion
point
was
of
from
this?
back, from side to inside.
Like,
And,
who
were you able
else
to determine
could it
teeth
be?
bridge?
Yes. So this is an image. So some of the measurements, most of the measurements are taken under a microscope, right? Because you do want to look at those, small areas that you cannot potentially see with the naked eye. So this is an image from a stereo microscope, and we're looking again at that bone. The area that is in the square, in that red square, it's pretty much for you guys to see the divots and the dips, right? So we actually measured the distances between those, and those actually gave us about 20 to 16.7 teeth per inch. Again, you're looking at non-uniform striations, right? So those striations are non-uniform. They're pretty much kind of all over, which is indicative that is a very inconsistent, right? That is a reciprocating motion with a straight blade, because those are actually straight, right?
Let's start talking about the legs. Let's start with the right leg, the right femur.
So in the right femur, I actually saw 2 cut marks, which are consistent with false starts.
And just to point out, the jury's able to actually see them. Those are those red lines on that left picture, correct?
Yeah. So if you follow the arrows, you will see just below the arrows, you will see the first one, and then just below that one, you will see the second one.
And so those represent times that the saw hit the bone, cut, but didn't go all the way through, and then it was attempted again.
That is correct.
Again, same questions. Let's talk about when we deal with the right leg, the direction of blade progress and the cutting stroke.
Sure. So
Jesus.
here, first of all, I try to identify the breakaway. So is it a notch or is it a spur? So in this case, we have a notch. If you can see it on that red square that I have in the presentation. And that is, again, what is going to help me determine, okay, was the blade progress from front to back in this case? And then the direction of cutting stroke was a little bit more different here. The cut was a little bit more clean. So I was not able to really determine where, how the cutting stroke was. In order for me to determine that, I usually look at kind of some chips of bone on the side, some different features. And in this case, I did not see any of those features in the bone.
Were you able to determine
Was
teeth
it
per
an
inch?
axe?
I was. Again, we have an image from the microscope and then pretty much an image from a photo of the actual bone so that you guys can see where I'm coming from with this microscopic image. And you can see on the arrows that those are all the grooves and dips that were used to determine teeth per inch. As you can see on this one, we have a lot, right? So we have about 25 to 14 teeth per inch that were calculated from all of those. And then you can also see on this one the striations, right? So the striations kind of go all over the place, right? Most of them are straight, and then they exhibit, again, that reciprocating motion with a series of striations in different anatomical planes. That is important for me because it's telling me that it's an inconsistent cut, right? That it's pretty much cutting in multiple anatomical planes, right? I'm cutting from the front, and then I go back, I go sideways. So it is an inconsistent cut.
And of course, you looked into why the saw set was here.
Yes. So again, we look at the breakaway spur and the notch. And in this case, again, I'm looking at the shape. And in this case, we do have a curved floor, and you can see over there on the L, the red one that is squared, which is consistent with a ripsaw. And also, we were able to measure, which is 0.07, which is indicating an approximation of the blade, of the width of the blade.
Okay, let's talk about the left leg. I think that's the final one for Mr. Halderson. The left femur here. Were you able to observe any false starts?
I was. In this case, we were able to see one cut mark, which is consistent with a false start. And again, is if you can see at the arrows, it's just pretty much below that arrow.
And here is a microscopic view of that false start.
Yes. This false start was actually very informative. Remember when I mentioned the deeper the false start, the better? So this one was quite deep. So I was able to measure, and then it gave me a lot of information. It gave me information about pretty much the width of the blade, which was 0.04, and also told me that there was a little bit of information about there was a wavy set blade. That is usually related to fine tooth hacksaw blades. A wavy set is just pretty much when the blade goes from one side, the tooth go from one side, they go to the other side, and then there's kind of in between, right? So there's a little bit of irregularities there, and that is going to be seen on the actual false start itself.
Blade progress and cutting stroke here.
Here again, we have a little bit of an entrance shaving. So it's giving me the blade progress. So this bone was actually cut from back to front, and the cutting stroke is telling me that the blade entered through the back of the bone and it went through the front. So it started on the back and then it goes all the way to the front.
So anatomically, if a person standing up, literally from their back forward.
Yes, pretty much.
Let's talk about teeth per inch and the inconsistent cut that you observed.
So again, I wanted to show you pretty much where those teeth per inch were measured from. So you can see again those little dips and grooves. Here we have 16.7 to 12.5 teeth per inch, and then I'm giving you a microscopic view of the bone itself, and it's straight, right? So it's telling me that it's a straight blade. However, the striations go in multiple anatomical planes. So it's telling me the inconsistency of the cut, right? So we go down, then we go up, then we go to the medial aspect. And the same pattern is seen
Could you
across the entire
imagine?
wall.
And perhaps this slide's a good time to ask this question, but why are the teeth per inch expressed in a range?
So
Could you
this is an
imagine?
estimation, right? So every time we do an anthropological analysis,
So as much
I
as
always
she's
tell, this is
saying
not a
that he's
determination.
changed
This is an
this,
estimate,
he's
right?
changed
So
that.
I'm
he's-
looking at depending on how many areas I
it's
can measure, right?
changing
So you want to give a
directions.
range.
It's
Also, you want to take
changing
into
this.
account,
It's
there's a
changing
lot of
that.
outliers, right? So you'd have to take into account the type of tool that was used. Was the tool new? Was the tool had a wear and tear? There's a lot of variables and a lot of features that I cannot
Like
account
that
for,
means
right?
he's
Also, the
stopping and
individual itself,
starting
the
and
position
changing
of the body
directions.
in terms to the individual. So those are the reasons why we always give an estimate, and within that estimate, we give a range.
Because he's
When it
sawing
comes to
through
Mr.
a
Halderson,
bone.
and we're going to go to some
and
more
he's
summary
getting
slides in a second. When it comes to
tired.
the dismemberment of his head, his arms, and his legs, were any of those dismemberments in your view performed with power saws?
No, I would say at this point, the examination and the analysis
Dear
really
God.
goes towards a handsaw. Again, we're looking at very inconsistent cuts. We're also looking at the striations, right? Those striations are telling me that there is pretty much a straight blade, right? It's not a circular blade. In addition to that, you want to look at the breakaway spur, right? That breakaway spur is very important, and they're not very big, which is indicative that there was not a lot of energy, right? So that's one of the reasons why you want to use a power-driven saw, right? Because you want to have a clean cut that is consistent and there's a lot of energy there, right? When you're using your hands, there's not going to be a lot of energy there. So therefore, the breakaway spur is going to be small and the cut is going to be inconsistent, right? Because especially in this case, when you're thinking about the femur is one of the thickest bones in your body. So it takes a lot of energy and a lot of force to cut through that bone. And you can kind of see it here on that microscopic view. It is quite thick.
When it comes to Mr. Halderson, were you aware he was found at a rural farm in the woods?
Yes,
And were you on that location? Were you there?
I was not.
Were you made aware at some point that there were some tools or saws found near the remains that were suspected to have been used in the dismemberment?
I was made aware.
And you were provided information regarding those tools?
Yes, they were providing me with some photos.
And what were you able to determine? You had what you needed from these photographs, correct?
Yep.
Okay. And tell us why that was important. You looked at it, what information you were able to glean from just looking at the tools.
Sure. So again, we go back to teeth per inch. That is a measurement that I can take just with a simple photograph and scales. So in this case, I wanted to pretty much gather the information and all the characteristics to see if those actually match what I was able to see on the bone. So the first thing that I look at was the Elway super saw, which I try to figure it out, and it's considered to be a keyhole saw or similar to a carpenter saw. So first of all, I was able to measure, and it has around 16 teeth per inch. Then there is a distance between the teeth of 0.06 inches, and then it has a flat chiseling tooth, which is consistent with a rib saw. There was a second item, which was a broken hacksaw. So I was able to measure, and that one had about 4 teeth per inch. And it had a distance between teeth of 0.19 inches to 0.31 inches. And again, this is a flat chiseling tooth consistent with a rib saw, and it also had a saw tooth consistent with a wavy set.
So now you have the measurements of all of those false starts, which give you the blade width and the teeth per inch and things of that sort. And now you have some suspected saws. You were able to compare all of those things, right?
Yeah, that is the goal of the analysis.
Are you able to definitively say 100% what saw was used?
No.
Are you able to say what saws were consistent with which cuts?
Yes, I can use the class. So I'm using the characteristics, right? The class characteristics of what I found in the bone. And I want to know, are they consistent with the class characteristic of these suspected tools, right? So I'm not going to be able to say, yes, this is the tool that was used, but we can say, don't exclude it or exclude it from your analysis or from the investigation.
And here's perhaps a summary of what we're talking about. Here we have the 4 cervical vertebrae, the right humerus, the left humerus, the right femur, the left femur, and then the 2 saws at the end. And here you're putting everything on a table.
Yes, so it's pretty much a summary. So because it's a lot of information, so that way you guys can pretty much do your own comparisons, right? So in this case, what I did is I put all the distance between teeth, and you can kind of see that most of them pretty much fit within that range, right? So I'm trying to see, is there something that fits within the range? The same with teeth per inch, the same with minimum curve, or just pretty much the saw set width. The cutting motion, right? Is it a reciprocating motion? The blade shape, is it straight or is it circular? And then also the saw set, right? Is it a rip saw, a cross cut? So in this case, I can say that the class characteristics that I saw on the elements or on the skeletal elements are consistent with the class characteristic of those 2 tools that were found at the site.
Sure. Are all of them consistent with the same tool, or are one of them consistent more with one tool than others?
Yeah, so actually the 4 cervical vertebrae seems to be a little bit more consistent with the broken hacksaw. And then the other elements, the right humerus, the left humerus, the right femur, and the left femur are more consistent with the keyhole or the Elway super saw.
So if we go back a slide, you're saying the vertebrae, or the 4 cervical vertebrae, where the head was removed, consistent with that image on the right of the broken hacksaw blade, and the limbs consistent with the Elway saw on the left.
That is correct.
Okay. We'll conclude with Mr. Halderson, and we'll move on to what's labeled Joe or Doe or a Jane Doe ultimately. We heard the medical examiners testify about these different body parts that were found of Krista Halderson, or what they identified as Krista Halderson. You identified part of them as Krista Halderson and part of them as Doe. Can you tell me why?
So obviously at the time, they were found in kind of the same area, but they were found apart, right? So I cannot pretty much say that they're both the same, even though potentially, right, based on the case circumstances, once you're trying to put everything together, I could potentially say that they belong to the same individual. Scientifically, I cannot do that, right? So I pretty much have to rely on DNA or an anthropological analysis in order to say that they both belong to the same individual.
Sure. And so when it comes to, and we'll combine that for the purposes of this question, Jane Doe and Krista Halderson, not only were you trying to answer the same question as you did with Mr. Halderson, which was what tools were used or how did this happen, but you were also trying to figure out, is this the same person?
That is correct.
So 2 questions there. Showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 376. Is this your report regarding Doe?
That is correct.
Okay. I'll move 376.
No objection.
It is received.
Talk to me a little bit about how you became involved in the summary of the early stages of this investigation.
Sure. So pretty much, again, there were several human remains that were found in the area on July 14. Once those remains were found, it was determined that it was a set of human remains consisting of a left leg and also a potential right leg as well. On July 16, there was an autopsy conducted. And once the autopsy was conducted, we pretty much did the same. We actually removed all the elements, dissected and then macerated the elements in water and let them air dry. In this case, we had a little bit more of information and more skeletal remains. So we had, like I said, the left leg, the feet, as well as the potential right leg.
So same process here, you macerated in water to remove the skeletal remains, essentially the bones from the legs.
Yeah, that is correct.
Can I ask you, were you on scene in this occasion?
I was not.
Are you aware of what the scene conditions were in terms of how the remains were found, in terms of any insect activity or maggot activity?
Yeah, I was able to look at some of the photographs.
Is it your opinion that any of those things affected your ability to obtain any results here?
I would say potentially for the identification, yes. The identification on one of them was a little bit more difficult than on the other one. On the other one, DNA was still available. On the other one, the elements and the outdoor elements really took a toll on the human remains. And those, we were not able to get DNA out of them.
Sure. Talk to me about the skeletal inventory of Jane Doe in this case.
So in this case, we have what you can call maybe a full-on right leg, right? So we have the right femur, we have the tibia and fibula, which composes of kind of your lower leg. And then we have the left foot and the right foot. And then if you can see just at the top of that left foot, there's 2 little pieces of bone. So those are the ends of the fibula and the tibia, right? So if you see to your right, that is the full-on bone. And then to your left, that's just a little bit of what is supposed to be a full-on tibia and fibula.
So the same with Mr. Halderson, same with Doe, you're gonna have some trauma to look at here and try to examine?
Yes, especially to that right femur, because we're missing the head. And then obviously we're missing a really big part of the tibia and the fibula.
All right, let's talk about that. Let's start with the right femur. Did you observe any false starts?
I did not.
Tell me about blade progress or cutting stroke, or what you were able to observe.
So in terms of the blade progress, I was able to determine that this was cut from back to front. And then the cutting stroke actually started from the medial side, from the inside all the way to the outside, right? So it was cut from back to front, and then the cut actually started from the inside all the way to the outside.
Talking about, were you able to observe on that bone teeth per inch and the blade set width?
Yes. So in this case, we were able to determine that it was about 20 to 12.5 teeth per inch. Again, it was an inconsistent cut. We're looking at very inconsistent striations, right? They're straight, which is suggestive of a straight blade. And again, is in very different anatomical planes. The reason why I included a photograph of, again, the microscopic view is so that you guys can see really those striations and how different they are, right? So the more inconsistent it is, the more inconsistent the striations, the more inconsistent the cut. In terms of blade set, I was able to determine that it was about 0.05 inches of a width. Actually, on this one, I was able to determine as well that the kerf floor is flat bottom and is square, again, indicative of a rib saw.
Talk about the left tibia, if you could.
Yeah, so this is the end of the tibia. This is what makes your ankle. So here you can see that there is at least 5 cut marks, which are consistent with false starts. And this one is a little bit difficult to see it because the bone kind of turns. So the cuts are actually going all the way from the front of that image all the way to the side.
Were you able to make, with the tibia, that tibia that makes up the ankle, were you able to make any conclusions as to the blade progress or the cutting stroke?
Yes. So in this case, we were able to look at the blade progress. The blade progress, again, was cut from front to back. And then the cutting stroke, how that knife entered through, was actually entering through the lateral. So pretty much the outside, and it goes all the way to the inside. So the cutting motion was from the outside to the inside. Again, non-uniform striations all over, which are indicative of reciprocating motion. And again, an inconsistent cut.
Speaking again, same bone, we're talking about the ankle. Were you able to determine teeth per inch and the blade set width?
Yes, so you can see pretty much on these red squares, again, those dips and those grooves, we were able to determine about 25 teeth per inch. And then the blade set, again, we were able to give an estimate about the width and say that is a rib saw based on the kerf floor, again, which was flat and squared.
Let's talk about the left fibula.
The left fibula, again, so the left fibula goes next to that other bone that you just saw. So that, again, makes up for your ankle. So we have about we have a false start. This false start was actually quite deep. So again, it gives me a lot of information about the blade set. So I was able to measure and it gave me 0.04 inches for a blade set. Again, it's suggestive of a raker set, which is, again, fine tooth, consistently usually with bow saws or pruning saws.
And staying with the left fibula, Blade progress, cutting stroke.
So in this case, this bone was actually cut from front to back. And then the cutting motion was very similar to the tibia, because you have to think about it, they're both right next to each other. So it was pretty much cut from the medial, through the medial, and then going all the way to the outside, right? So it's very consistent with the tibia that we just saw. Again, non-uniform striations, which are indicative of reciprocating motion, and is also a straight blade. In this case, we're looking at teeth per inch, and it's about 20 teeth per inch. And the blade set, again, was consistent with a rip saw. I added a photo of the microscopic image, so that you guys can see where those dips and those grooves were, so that we can measure those and get those teeth per inch.
As to Jane Doe, you reached some conclusions.
I did. Pretty much, in this case, according to the blade set, we can categorize these characteristics into a hacksaw, a potential rip saw, or also a keyhole saw. There was a kerf width a little bit higher, which was about 0.07 to 0.08, which is indicative of a cross cut or a carpenter saw. Pretty much all skeletal elements show me that there was a flat bottom, right, at that breakaway spur, and that it was squared, which is indicative of a rip saw tooth. And finally, pretty much in terms of teeth per inch, all of them were between 25 all the way to 12. The striations were all straight, which indicative of a straight blade. They were non-uniform and in different anatomical planes. Again, this is consistent with a handsaw, right, versus that power-driven saw.
Regarding all the cuts that you saw, the dismemberment cuts with Jane Doe, are they consistent with the blades that we've previously looked at least in characteristics, the keyhole saw and the broken hacksaw blade?
Yeah, so all the characteristics of this particular individual were consistent, again, with the characteristics of those two tools that were found at the scene.
Understood. Now, you indicated that there were some human remains found nearby that were by DNA positively identified to Crystal Halderson. You had to write a separate report for that set of remains, correct?
That is correct.
Right, I'm showing you it's been marked as exhibit number 377. Is that, in fact, that report?
That is correct.
I'll move that 377 report into evidence.
No objection.
It is received.
And again, same questions. Here, we're going to talk about, is Crystal Halderson also Jane Doe, but also the same thing as how were these cuts made, right?
That's correct.
All right. Talk to me, same general observations about how you became involved in this investigation with Krista?
Yeah, so pretty much on July 14, again, there was 2 sets of human remains that were found. And then in this case, pretty much the reason why we had to assign 2 different case numbers, right? Scientifically, I cannot say that they're both the same. So based on not just DNA, but also the anthropological analysis, we try to narrow it down to see if in fact these remains do belong to Krista.
Same process of essentially before, but you attended, or there was an autopsy performed, and then the remains were transferred to you for your work at some point.
That is correct. In this case, in addition to the sharp force trauma, right, and the type of analysis that we're trying to do, we're also trying to identify the individual and try to see if what I do is a morphological analysis. So I look at the shape and I look at the size, and I also look at the measurement. So I measure the bone and I try to pretty much analyze and see if they actually are similar to each other.
Same process, macerated in water, the skeletal remains were air dried, and then you perform some analysis.
That is correct.
All right, let's talk about the skeletal inventory of Crystal Halderson.
So in this case, the skeletal inventory consisted of just the shaft of the femur, right? So if you have your leg, I'm missing pretty much the top part of it. The distal end, which is the part that makes up your knee, was still there, but it was actually separated. We have a patella, which is your kneecap, and that one belongs to the left side. We also have a left fibula and a left proximal shaft of the tibia. Again, that's your lower leg, but we're missing those 2 ends of it.
So let's perform the same work as we have. Let's start with the left femur. Were you able to observe false starts there?
We did. So we're looking at the top part of the femur, right? So we had pretty much the shaft. So this is just the top, and we're looking at one superficial false start.
Able to determine blade progress and cutting stroke?
Yes. In this case, we can say that the bone was cut from front to back, and that the cutting stroke was actually from the front all the way to the back. So pretty much the blade was entering through the front and cutting all the way to the back.
Were you able to determine teeth per inch?
Yes. So in this case, we were able to determine about 9.1 teeth per inch and 6.7 to 5.9 teeth per inch. Again, the striations on the breakaway spur actually gave me indications that this was a reciprocating motion. And then the floor itself gave me information about the width of the blade.
And there, are we looking at a close-up of a microscopic view of that?
Yeah, so that's pretty much how I was able to calculate the teeth per inch. So I'm looking again at the top part of that bone, and I'm looking, that is a breakaway spur. And I'm actually looking under the microscope at that breakaway spur. And then,
Sorry.
No, you're fine. And then the second one is the actual floor, right? So remember that once it cuts, that floor in between that breakaway spur or notch and the actual cut, that area in between is very important. That's what we call the floor. And on that one, I was able to determine that it was, again, flat bottom and it was squared, which is suggestive of a rip saw. And then we were able to measure it in order to get a little bit of information about the blade set.
Flat bottom, girl.
Crystal Halderson's left femur.
Yeah, so in this case, if you remember, these were 2 separated items on the skeletal inventory. So what I did is I put them back together. And you can kind of see on those arrows, all of those are false starts. We had a total of 10 false starts, and some of them were quite deep.
Sure. This is more false starts than we've seen in some of the previous images of Bart and Jane Doe, correct?
That is correct.
False starts are attempts. So one explanation, it could be someone is getting fatigued. That's possible?
Yeah, it could be an explanation.
Sure. Or they're just having trouble.
Yeah, it could be another.
talk to me about those false starts and what we're looking at there.
So what I did is I actually looked at under a microscope because I saw they were quite deep. So again, it gives me a lot of information. So in this case, I was able to get a little bit of information about the blade, the width of the blade, and I was also able to determine that it was a curved step blade. Again, that's because of the shape of the actual false start alone. Raker sets are usually considered to be just fine tooth bow saws or pruning saws or sometimes cable saws, depending on the brand.
Talk to me about blade progress and the cutting stroke.
So in this case, you're looking at kind of the medial view of that bone. So remember, I put it back together and we are able, so we're looking kind of the inside, almost by your knee. And you can see the red arrow is the one that gives you the blade progress. So the bone was actually cut from the inside all the way to the outside. So that's how the cut actually was made. The cutting stroke or the blade actually was cutting through the front. So that cutting motion was from front to back.
We able to determine teeth per inch for this cut.
So again, we looked under the microscope and we had about 12 teeth per inch on average on the striations in those dips and grooves. Again, the striations were indicative of a reciprocating motion in different anatomical planes. Again, we're looking for that, we're seeing that inconsistent cut throughout.
And the blade set width.
Yeah, in this case, we had a really defined floor. In this case, it was very flat bottom, it was squared. You can see it over there on the L, which is indicative again of that rip saw. And then it was also able to give me information about the blade set.
So we talked about those two questions, which is Doe and Krista the same person? And then we're going to talk about the tools, but starting with Doe and Krista, what are we looking at there?
So we're comparing, so what I try to do is to compare each element, right? So I know I have two femora, right? So in this case, what I did is I put them together just to pretty much try to understand the shape and the size, right? Aside from that, I try to take measurements. In this case, I was a little bit, I was not able to take a lot of measurements because I'm missing the top part. And most of the measurements that we do take involve that top part. So I was able to measure the bottoms, right? So pretty much the distance from that area, that kind of wider area that you have, that's where your knee kind of forms. So I was able to measure that, and that the right one gave me about 74 millimeters, and the left one gave me 73 millimeters.
Tell us about the slide.
So we're looking here at the left tibia. So pretty much your lower leg. So we're looking at that lower end of the tibia that is very close to forming your ankle. And here you can see multiple false starts. The left tibia exhibits at least 6 cut marks that are consistent with false starts.
And this is a more close-up view of that?
Yes. Again, these were quite deep, so it gives me a lot of information. So we wanted to look at them under the microscope. And under the microscope, we were able to see, again, a blade set width of about 0.01. And again, those were flat bottom and they were squared. The walls were squared, so that is indicative of a rip saw.
And here you have to determine blade progress and cutting stroke, of course.
Yeah, so again, we're looking at the whole bone, the whole lower left leg, the red arrow, which is indicative of the blade progress. So it seems like this bone was cut from front to back. And then the cutting stroke of how that knife went through, how that saw went through, it went through the anterior, so the front of it, and it kind of went down to medial. So it went from front to side a little bit. So it was almost in an angle.
And lastly, when it comes to at least the measurements, you have to determine teeth per inch. And here we have maybe an overall view and then a microscopic view.
That is correct. So here we're looking again at those grooves and those dips, and we have about 5.6 to 4.8
bone
teeth per
looks
inch.
like.
So now we're just going to compare essentially Krista to Doe in almost like a puzzle-like fashion. Okay?
Yeah.
Tell me what you're doing there.
So I'm pretty much trying to compare. And again, in this case, I'm not just looking at the shape and the size and the measurements, but I'm also trying to see if it actually fits together, right? So if they can join. So in this case, we have the distal end, right? That ankle part of Doe. And then we have what we already know and was positively identified as Krista. And as you can see on the photos, it actually conjoins fairly well. So obviously we were able to also take some measurements and look at the morphological, overview, the size and the shape, and it was a close match.
And here's perhaps a table comparing them.
Yes, so these are all the measurements that I was able to take. These are standard measurements that we use whenever we are trying to identify someone. And these are specified for the tibia and fibula. And as you can see, most of the measurements are quite similar, right? In addition to that, you want to look at the overall shape and size of the bone, right? So that's why we want to put it all together in one image so that you guys can see based to next to a scale how similar they are.
And so next we have a slide about the left fibula.
Yes, so here the left fibula, again, we do have one false start. Located just
funny.
below the initial corner of the curve.
And here we have blade progress and cutting stroke again. Just briefly describe that.
Yeah, pretty much very similar to the tibia, right? It's next to the tibia. So it was cut from front to back, and the cutting stroke was pretty much entering through the inside and exiting through the outside.
Okay. And then the teeth per inch.
The teeth per inch in this case was about 11.1 teeth per inch. And again, we go back to this non-uniform straight striations is a reciprocating action with a straight blade.
And then before we get to the summary, here just is a comparison at a different angle or a different view, correct?
Yes, so we just wanted to compare, right, that Doe, that little piece of bone that we found that makes your ankle, and we wanted to compare it and see. And then you can see here, it actually matches fairly well.
I think I asked this before with Mr. Halderson, but as to Doe and Krista, before we get to the summary, is all of these cuts, from your estimation, were made with hand saws, not power saws, correct?
That is correct.
And There were two saws in here found near Bart Halderson, not Krista Halderson, but you use those at least in considering making a table regarding how which saws were possibly used to cut Krista Halderson's legs.
That's correct.
And we're looking at the table there?
Yes.
All right.
So it's a very similar table to the other one.
Sure. Is it your opinion that those two saws on this slide, the all-way saw and the broken hacksaw, are they should they be ruled out as possibly the saws that were used to dismember Krista's legs?
They should not be ruled out.
Tell us about this slide.
So pretty much in terms of trying to identify the other set of remains that we had as doe. So in this case, as I mentioned, they were able to identify one set of human remains as Krista Halderson via DNA. The other set of remains, the tissue was quite mummified, so we were not able to really obtain DNA out of that second set of remains. However, we were able to do an anthropological analysis. So we were able to measure, we were able to compare the size and the shape. And given all of that information, this association can really provide a means to identify that second set of human remains as Krista.
So if we started at the beginning with those questions as to Bart, were those saws consistent with his dismemberment? Your answer was yes.
Yes.
Those two saws. And as to Krista and what you identified as doe as being Krista, those saws are consistent.
Yeah, all the class characteristics are consistent.
And then you were able to, the third question, you were able to positively identify doe essentially as being Krista.
Yeah, it's pretty much giving you the information to say that yes, the second set of remains is consistent with Krista.
The next part of your work here, and the last part, you'd like any water?
Okay.
You were asked at times to actually go over to the Halderson home on Oak Springs in Windsor to assist them in some remains they were finding at the home, correct?
That is correct.
What is your role when you're called to a crime scene like that?
In this particular case, they were calling our office in order to determine if the remains, if what they have at the house was actually human remains or not.
And did you actually go over to the house?
I did.
Okay. Showing it's been marked in this case, exhibit number 378. Is this your report related to your visits to the Halderson home?
That is correct.
Were you there on a couple different occasions?
I was.
When you were at the Halderson home doing this work, were you by yourself or were you assisted by other people in law enforcement to assist you in some of your work?
Yeah, so the first time that I was called, pretty much there were several investigators there, and I was able to do kind of a quick analysis. They were pretty much trying to determine, right, do we have human remains here or not? Because if so, then obviously there's a different type of approach that we need to take when we're trying to search and recover those remains. So on the first time that I went there, I actually was shown to the house and then shown to what they thought were human remains. And then once we determined that there were in fact human remains, we did a second visit. And on that second visit, it was a little bit more labor intensive in order to try to pinpoint and find all the human remains.
And before we start, we're gonna hear about a couple different areas or things you searched in the home. But your analysis was the fireplace itself, the fireplace grate, the ash pit below the fireplace, a vacuum, and then a fire pit in the backyard.
That is correct.
And just to start off, there's nothing in that fire pit in the backyard.
No, there was none.
All right, and let's start with the vacuum cleaner. You at some point examined a vacuum cleaner that was found in the Halderson home.
That's correct.
Okay. And is that in fact a vacuum cleaner?
That is the vacuum cleaner.
What happened? How did you examine it? And tell us what we're looking at here.
So we pretty much dissected the vacuum. So we almost did an autopsy on the vacuum. So we remove everything from it so that we can get to the inside. So we documented every single step of the way. And what you're looking at is pretty much what we were able to recover from the inside of the vacuum, right? So there's a lot of dust. However, there were other elements there that we were able to recover.
Sure. I'm going to ask you about a couple of those. Let's just start maybe on the far right side of that tray. There's some paper-looking material. What is that?
You mean the white paper that is shredded?
Yeah, let's
Okay,
start there.
yeah.
Were you able to identify that as anything other than just paper?
It was just shredded paper, yeah.
Okay. Above that, there's a small pile of looks to be debris. Were you able to identify that at all?
Seems we were not really able to ID. It seems like it was more like seeds and kind of random things that you find outside. Yeah.
And if we keep moving counterclockwise, I suppose, around, there's a pile of clear material there. Almost looks like rock salt. What is that?
That was actually glass.
And during this case, while you were in the Halderson home, did you have an opportunity to actually look through the fireplace yourself?
I did.
And is that glass consistent with glass you found in the fireplace?
There was broken glass in the fireplace.
Slightly to the left of that, continuing going counterclockwise, there appears to be a pile of debris. What is that?
We were not 100% sure. It seems like it was almost like burn, something kind of woodish. We were not really able to identify that very well. It was quite dark.
And we'll save the bottom left corner for a second, but in the very center appears to be a pile of dirt. Is that what it is?
Yeah, it was just dirt from normal vacuum.
And in the bottom, there's some dog hair, pretty much.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. There's some white rocks, and so the judge is clear on the record. I'm pointing to the bottom left corner of this tray. What are those?
That is bone.
How
And
are
the
you able to
vacuum.
tell it's bone?
Again, by the size and the shape and the morphology, right? So bone is very unique. So when you're looking at bone, you're looking at two types of bone. One, remember that spongy look-like bone that we had in
Like
the cervical
human
vertebrae?
bone
So
or
that's
dog
one type of
bone?
and that's usually on the inside,
Not like
right? You want to think about it
Dog's
as
bone, but like
a sponge that has little holes, and those little holes are the ones that kind of
Bones
give
that
you the
dogs
nutrients, I guess,
chew.
or the blood vessels. That's kind of the reasoning for that. The outside of the bone is called compact bone. I always think about it as concrete. It looks like cement, right? So it's usually the outside of it. The reason why it's like that is because it gives you the shape, right? So the inside is very hollow so that you can get the nutrients, and the outside is the one that gives you the shape. So you do want that to be really strong and really hard. So whenever you have bone pieces, I'm always looking for that. I'm looking for that spongy bone and that really concrete or compact bone. And there were several features on those little fragments that can tell me that that was bone.
In relatively to other fragments you may have found in this investigation in the Halderson home, were those somewhat small?
They are very small and very fragile.
So we talked about it being bone, and just so no one's, you cannot positively say that's human bone, correct?
No, I can't.
What's the difference between what you're able to identify as bone and what you can positively identify as human bone? What are you looking for?
So I'm looking for, again, features, right? So the morphological features, the size and the shape. Aside from that, I'm also looking, so bone is the one that is responsible. So the bone actually attaches to the muscle, right? So those areas actually have some bumps and grooves that are very unique to the bone, right? So as an anthropologist and as an osteologist, right? Somebody that knows the bones really well, I know where all those features are, right? So I know where each muscle attaches. I know the features of each bone as well, right? So facets, like those flat areas where it attaches to another bone. So me knowing the features and the characteristics of each human bone, I can actually look at another fragment and say, yes, this is human, this is not human, right? We do get training on non-human remains, right? So deer, dogs, anything else that we know potentially could be of an analysis in the future.
Are you able to say whether or not, or what type of bone that is? Whether it's an animal bone or whether it is a human bone?
No, I can't.
Oh my God.
I can say that it's bone. I cannot say that it's human.
Let's talk about the fireplace itself. Now, this is the physical fireplace. You observed this, correct?
Yes, I did.
Swear.
Showing that what's already been admitted is 239. Is that the fireplace, in fact, that you observed?
Yes.
Showing further what's been identified and admitted evidence is 324. There's a spot on the top of the fireplace, kind of there in the center, that was of interest to people.
Yes, that is the reason why I was called in the first place.
And just to go back, we're talking about the spot in the very center of that photograph.
Yeah, that white spot. Yes.
Okay. Were you able to take that little piece off at some point?
So when I arrived to the residence, that piece was actually already removed by one of the investigators.
And you take a look.
I did.
Okay. Are we looking at it there?
Yeah, it's just a nicer picture of it.
And here it's labeled skeletal inventory.
A
Can you
nicer
tell us what we're
picture
looking
of
at there in some of these nicer photos that are maybe a bit better lit than the photos on scene?
Sure. So this is actually that little piece of bone that you guys saw in that other picture. So when I was asked to look at the photo and look at the remains, the main question was, is this bone? And if so, is this human? So the first thing that I can tell you is that it is bone, right? Remember that categorization of spongy bone and compact bone. So you can actually see it in this image. You can kind of see that sponge in between, and you can kind of see that compact bone in the top also and on the back. The second thing that I can tell you is that this is potentially consistent with cranial bone or bone from the skull. The reason for that is because, so the skull is very unique, and the skull is composed of 3 layers of bone. So we have that compact bone, that cement looking like bone. Then we have spongy bone in the middle, and then we have another layer, which is compact bone. So it's almost like a sandwich, right? So as bone, especially in this case, potentially underwent fire damage or thermal damage, that first layer of bone is gonna be destroyed, and it's gonna expose that second layer. So that's what it's telling me, that is potentially associated with the skull or the head. And then in this case, I know you guys can't see it very well, but there's actually a cranial suture. So as you grow, you right now have close to 206 bones. But when you were little, you probably had more. And the reason for that is because all of those bones are going to fuse, right? So the same happens with the skull. Those bones are going to fuse. And those lines of fusion are what we call sutures or cranial sutures. So those lines of fusion are very informative for us. It can give us information about age, sometimes can give us other information related to ancestral background. So in this case, I can see on one of the edges that it is a suspected cranial suture.
You're able to find other bones in the skeletal inventory of the fireplace.
Yes. So we were able to search throughout, and we found other pieces of bone scattered around.
Do you know anything, or can you tell us anything about these pieces?
So to your left, right? Yeah. So you have pretty much kind of a group of pieces of bone. These are too small for me to identify, but again, we can go back and say that they're bone, right? Because we have that spongy material, and we also have that flat material that is consistent with compact bone. On the other side, that is actually the root of a tooth. It's pretty much the shape consistent with a root.
As well as the fire itself and the built fire, you looked at the fireplace grate.
I did.
Showing the jury what's been marked as 323, just an overview of the grates, and 331, perhaps zoomed in a bit closer. Was there anything that started to cause you pause or suspicion as you looked at some of these photos or on scene?
Yes, so I was able to look at the grate pretty much in situ, right? So they removed the grate from the initial, from the original location, and I was able to look at it, and I noticed that there was a human crown or a dental crown stuck to the grate.
And are we looking at that right now?
Yes.
And if you can crank your head a little bit to the screen, am I pointing to it with the laser right now?
Yeah, that's the one.
Slightly top right center.
Yes.
For the court record. You pulled that off at some point?
We did. We
That's what
removed
we're
it.
looking at.
Yep. And that's exactly what you're kind of looking. So you're looking again to that piece of bone that was consistent to be human, that is consistent with the cranial bone, and then the other one is the dental crown. That is potentially a molar. Right? So there's a lot of surface area there. But you can see the grooves, right, that are very, very unique, and those are very unique to humans.
And so these were the two areas of what you.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!
Let's talk about the ash trap a little bit. There's a lot of work performed with the ash trap.
Yes, there was a lot of work done.
Okay. Showing the jury what's been marked as exhibit number 334. They've seen this before, and they've heard from Mr. Boswell testified, who I'm sure you know. This was in the basement of the Halderson home?
That's correct.
Okay. And Mr. Boswell testified that he was unable to kind of fit himself in there, but were you able to kind of fit
Oh my
yourself
God!
in
I
there?
Yes, I was able to get in there.
What is it? Can you just
Get
describe
on
the general?
it. I'm just
So,
trying to finish the
So just so
video,
you guys can
y'all.
get a little bit of an idea. So we have those 3 different squares. So I was able to kind of fit in through that first one and then also the last one. The reason for that is because I really wanted to see if there was bone in
You
there.
hear
right?
noise
So
in
that's
the
pretty much the
background.
pit. So
I got
whatever
dogs
was on
and
the top
cats
can potentially
fighting.
be on the bottom as
I
well.
got a kid
So,
in the
and I really want to see
shower
it
over
without being
here.
undisturbed. So I tried to snuck in and try to fit in there. And you can see
I
it's
got
almost
an
like a
extra
little
dog
mountain.
in the house.
And then at the top of it, you can kind of see,
Who's
again,
done
that
peed
brittle bone-like material that had different
and
colors,
thrown
right?
up.
That white kind of residue, that black residue. So it's quite unique.
And so I'm showing now 337. Is that the inside?
Yeah, that is the inside.
All
So you can
within the
kind of see
last 30
little
minutes.
And is that on the right side of that?
Me
photo?
trying
Yes.
to film this.
You're an anthropologist by
I
trade.
cannot.
Is ash or an ash trap kind of an ideal environment to perform an archaeological dig for bone? Or for
Cat and
fossils or
dog are
something
still
like that?
going at it.
It's not. It's very difficult. If you
Yeah.
want to think about it in terms of just a regular archaeological dig, you're always digging in dirt.
I'm not sitting through
So,
this again.
so it's the consistency is there,
this
so
is
you can
what it
actually
is.
move the dirt, and you can kind of go by layers. It's difficult, but it's definitely possible. Here, it was a little bit more tricky because A, of the confined environment, and second, the material itself, right? This is very loose, so we have to be very careful when we were pretty much removing everything.
Do you believe it's possible that some material had sunk through as you were removing some of the ash material?
I think so, yeah.
In general, we'll talk about what your findings were in a second, but you found a number of items that you believe to be bone in the ash trap, correct?
Yes.
Many items.
Yeah, I would say so.
Were the majority on top, or were they in the middle or in the bottom or something else? How would you describe where kind of in this pile you were able to remove those items from?
So the majority of the elements were actually in the top. So what we did is we actually separated and we try to keep it very consistent here. So we only had one person digging in this area, so we can keep it, again, consistent. And then we try to do it by layers, pretty much like an archaeological dig, right? So you go layer by layer, because I really wanted to get a sense of how much was at the top, right? And then do we have anything at the bottom as well? So we separated it by pretty much once everything was out, we sifted everything that was taken. And then once it was sifted, it was put in a box, and that box was given a number, right? 1 being at the top, and I think it was 12 or 13 being at the bottom, right? You have to remember this is super loose soil. So yes, at some point, I do believe that maybe some of those elements trickle down to another layer, but I think we were quite successful at getting as much material as possible without really disturbing the evidence.
And so as the material was removed, it was sifted,
Yes.
and then the remains were put into Tupperware containers, essentially?
Yep, pretty much.
All right. And you listed, in fact, in your report, as you went through, there were 12 Tupperware containers of material of actual, fragments taken out, and you listed per container how much or which elements you found in which Tupperware container, correct?
Yes, I wanted to keep it consistent, and especially with this being such a difficult environment, I wanted to make sure that everything was labeled by container, and then also make sure that those containers were associated with the level as best as we could.
And we don't have to go through every single one. We're going to look at a lot of them. However, in your report, it's fair to say that box 1, for instance, the top, your list took up the better part of 3 pages of identified material.
Yeah, there was a lot of material in that first box.
Box 2, a couple pages itself.
Yes.
And then as we get to the end, there were numerous in Tupperware's 11 and 12 that had nothing in them.
Yeah, I agree.
Let's talk about the process. You have a little bit written here, but tell us about this slide and maybe what we're looking at with those Tupperwares.
So pretty much, again, we go back. So we try to do, this is, if you want to categorize
Like
as an archaeological dig, it was pretty much exactly what it was, right? So we go out, we try to dig through it. Again, we decided to just keep one person in that area so that it is consistent, plus it was too small for 2 people to be in there. And then from there, to a table. So we had several tables laid out outside, and we had multiple law enforcement agents sifting throughout. Some of them had a lot of experience doing this before. So I was jumping back and forth from table to table, right? And also kind of checking what group or what was extracted from the original location and where it was taken. And then from there, it was sifted. Everything that was found that was suspected to be human was put in these containers. And as you can see, it kind of looks a little bit rough, right? Because some of them do know what bone is, and some of them, didn't think, well, I'm not 100% sure if this is bone, so I'm putting it in. So they put everything in there, right? We did not toss anything. And then from there, we actually had 12 boxes with significant material.
And you took that back to the medical examiner's office?
I did.
And there are more ideal conditions there for you to actually examine the bone?
Yes. So I do a second sifting. So I
Well,
actually do it by hand.
I don't know what this is,
And I go
so I'm gonna
element by
just put
element.
it in
And
here.
I try to clean them a little bit with just like a toothbrush. And I try to determine if this is in fact bone or not.
And we're just going to look at a couple different photographs. Here are varying Tupperware. Some of them have no items in there. Some of them have a lot.
That is correct.
And we'll just keep looking at them and just different ones that were removed that day. And here we're getting maybe the end where there's very little.
Yeah, so that's the end. And we also research the fireplace, and we research the fireplace grate just to make sure that we didn't miss anything.
You go back to the medical examiner's office. Tell us what you do. We have some example photos here just to allow you to maybe describe what your process is.
Sure. So what you're looking at is box 1. So what I try to do is I sit down in front of my box, and I go element by element. I have a toothbrush. I try to have some tools with me because, again, these are very fragile elements. So you do want to make sure that they don't crumble in your hand and that you can get as much information as possible. And then what I try to do is I laid out paper, like you can see there, and I label it box 1 of 12. And then I start categorizing them. So in this case, you can see almost at the bottom, you have cranial fragments, right? So I try to pretty much establish, okay, this is my first cranial fragment that I found in this box. So I usually label it as A. So that way, if I have to go back, I kind of remember pretty much what the inventory was. So I go by cranial fragments, dentals or dentition, right? Any teeth, vertebrae. We found a potential long bone. I found some hands and then also some small fragments that I cannot identify. So everything that you see that says small fragments, that's something that I know it's bone, but it's too small for me to say something about it.
By their location, these bone fragments that were found in the ash trap, you strongly suspected, I believe, that they've been burnt.
Yes.
Talk a bit about, if you could, the burning of bone and what that does to your analysis. And I think we have an example here that's not a bone in this case, but just an example.
They were in the ash.
When bone is burning, so you have to kind of go back a little bit to biology. So bone, again, has 2 major components. We have the organic material, which is, the blood, I think about it almost like the good stuff, right? The DNA, everything that is inside that bone. And then I have the inorganic material. Inorganic material is salts, it's minerals. Those are the ones that go in the outside of the bone. Those are the ones that give the shape of the bone, right? So when it undergoes fire, the first thing that is going to burn is the organic material, right? So that is why it is so difficult to get DNA out of burnt bone, right? Because that inside, that organic material, that good stuff, actually burns quite quickly. So then the reason why you get still the shape of the bone is because you have that minerals. The minerals won't burn. So that is the reason why you still have that shape of that bone, even though it undergoes fire, right? So the color of the bone is extremely important to me because it tells me the time, the duration, right? So if you remember the other images of the other bones were kind of a yellowish, kind of brownish color. So that is unaltered bone, right? So that is bone that has not been through any type of damage. So then as the bone is exposed to the fire, you're gonna see that it's starting to get black, right? So obviously that organic material is starting to burn, but that inorganic material is still quite good. And as you can see, is moving from brown, which we call charred bone, all the way to calcined bone. Calcined bone is white, so that white kind of grayish color. So that tells me A, that all the organic material is gone, and B is telling me that the bone is quite fragmented. However, it has been in the fire for a very long time, right? So the color is giving me a lot of information about the duration of the fire.
Talk to me about bones you were
White bone. The dental black color, but the reason for that is because bones were actually embedded in, at some point, they were embedded in the mandible, right? So usually the mandible is the first one that burns, right? So as that burns, the teeth are protected. And then once they're exposed, they're usually exposed to the fire and usually get that kind of black to grayish color, right? So I'm expecting that on the teeth. However, on the bone, you can kind of see that is all white, right? So we have the cranial fragments at the bottom, and those are quite white. And then you have the vertebrae, which is just on top of the dentition, and those are they're also quite white. And you can kind of see, we do see that proximal distal end of a long bone that is kind of transitioning, right? You see that it's a little bit black, and it kind of transitions into a white bone. So that also tells me that it was exposed to the fire for a long time.
We're going to look at the inventory, skeletal inventory, much like we did with Bart and Krista, the remains. We're not going to look at every photograph, correct?
Yeah, there are too many.
But we have some examples here, and let's just go left to right. So let's start with the left, which is the rest of the and then we'll just go left to right, that left image.
So these are pretty much just cranial bones. They were too small for me to kind of pinpoint, okay, where they're located. Is it the front, the back? But I can tell you that some of them, most of them were human, and they were cranial bones, but they were too small for me to try to pinpoint exactly where they're located.
What that center image?
So that center image is actually fragment. You remember, right? Take a peek at the top. You can kind of see that little mark. That is actually a cranial suture and is a well-defined cranial suture. And this bone, if you flip it, you can kind of see again that layer, right? Remember that sandwich-like where you have that compact bone and then you have that spongy bone in the middle, and then you have, so you can actually see the layers of that bone.
Are those cranial sutures informative in any way as anthropologists to who this person was in terms of their gender or age or anything like that?
Yeah, so again, looking at age, the cranial sutures are actually very informative to tell age, right? Because if you think about it, as your bones are pretty much growing and fusing, there is a documented information and documented data about how the sutures should look like when you are a kid, a young adult, and then an adult. In this case, they're completely sutured, so that tells me that this was an adult.
And what about the image on the right?
So again, this is cranial bone. The good thing about this one is that I was able to pinpoint that it's in this area over here. So kind of by your ear. So that area over there is very unique because there's a lot of sutures, right? There's a lot of bones that kind of meet in this area. And that tells me that it was pretty much, I can't tell you if it's left or right, but I can definitely tell you that it was in this area.
Move to the next slide. You found a number of teeth in this restaurant, correct?
I did.
So we're looking at photographs. Just what are we looking at there?
So pretty much we're looking at, so
Oh my God, we're looking at
in the
bones.
blue background, they are considered to be canines or central incisors or
Not
lateral,
dogs.
that might be premolars, kind of after your canines. But you can see well-defined roots in here. And then on the black one, you can actually see it's a little bit bigger, right? A little bit wider, which could potentially indicate that is a molar, right? So the ones in the back.
Now, sometimes when we hear on the news that someone like you is involved in a case, we'll hear that they're looking at dental records to identify human remains. What do people mean by that when they say they're looking at dental records? And what role does dental records have in identifying teeth?
That's a good question.
Yeah, so in this case, when we're trying to identify someone with dentals, what we do is we go back to their medical records, right? So their dental records, and we get x-rays, we get pretty much their dental chart. When you go to the dentist and you get an x-ray, all of your teeth are in what we call in situ. So they are still embedded in your jaw, right? That is one of the unique features that the odontologist and myself use for identification, right? Because the shape of that root is actually linked or associated with the mandible, right? So the mandible is the kind of the one that works with the tooth to create that shape, right? So that's what we tend to use. One of the many characteristics that we use. When you have teeth that are just loose, that you don't have a mandible, it gets very tough. It gets very difficult to identify them because, first of all, you need to figure it out what tooth this is, right? So in this case, I'm missing a lot of the crowns.
So
I'm having a hard time
use dental
saying,
records.
well, it looks like a central incisor.
Look at
It
it
looks like
too.
a lateral incisor. So that's where the
Doesn't work
challenges
like
of
that.
identification come, right? Because we're missing the crown and we're also missing the mandible where those go.
So the phrase identify someone by dental records is the position of their teeth, not so much the action.
Yeah, that's one of the characteristics that we use.
We have some additional teeth.
Yeah, so as you can see, these have a little bit of a different color. So that's why I put a black background so that you guys can see it a little bit better. You can see we have all the way to your left and all the way to your right. Those are potentially canines or premolars, but then the ones in the center are a little bit bigger, right? So those are the ones that go all the way in the back, the molars, right? When you're chewing, most of the food goes to the back, and those are the ones that are responsible for that. So we were able to find an array of different types of teeth.
And just because this is the last slide dealing with teeth, the overall question, you were not able to identify whose teeth these were because of the condition they were in and how they were removed, essentially.
That's
Or
correct.
else this
And did you
teeth
consult with other
would
experts
be
in
in
the
the
field?
We did.
fireplace.
What are we looking at there?
So this is a vertebrae. Specifically, it is so the one on your left, that is a cervical vertebrae. I don't know if you remember those images at the beginning, right? So we have those
The
little
top.
pieces of bone that kind of come out, and then you have that center bone. So we're actually looking at one half of it. So you can see kind of the center bone in the middle, and then that little piece of bone, that flat piece of bone, that is supposed to attach to another vertebrae, right? And that is the cervical vertebrae. The reason for that is I'm looking for several features. Again, the cervical vertebrae are very small, and they have several features that are telling me that this is cervical. None other vertebrae has those features, and this one has the features of a cervical vertebrae. The same with the other image. Again, you can see this is probably a first or a second. The reason for that is because of the curvature of that little piece of bone. Usually the ones at the top that hold your skull are very curved because they want to hold that weight. So that feature was very informative.
And because it's a first or a second, you don't have either Bart or Krista's first or second vertebrae in any of the remains you examined, correct?
That's correct.
With Bart, you only had the fourth and below, and with Krista, you had none.
That's correct.
And what are we looking at here in the ash trap images?
So this is just a summary of what I found for what I can categorize as hands. So that little
Hands?
to your left, that long piece of bone, that is actually part of your hand here. So it's one of these. The reason why I know it's a hand and not a foot is because it's very round, right? So the ones in your hand, those little pieces of bone, they're very round. The ones in your feet are actually quite wide.
Which
you have to think
bone?
about holding all that weight, right? So that one over there is just here, one of these. And then the two other ones are from your fingers. So actually, those are what we call distal phalanges. So these are the ones that are here pretty much.
Phalanges.
Yes.
Where's this image?
Oh my god.
So this is what I classified as long bones because I was not 100% sure if it was left or right. So to your left, if you look at it kind of from an angle, that is actually the knee. So I don't know if you remember the femur, right, and those little kind of grooves where the knee goes. So this is actually one of the grooves of a femur. And then on the other side, that is actually from a tibia. So the tibia, I don't know if you remember from those images, is actually very sharp. It has a very sharp edge, and that is very unique of the tibia. There's no other bone that has that type of sharpness. So we can definitely say that that is a tibia. I just can't tell you if it's a left or right.
That concludes, and we have more slides, obviously, but that's the sample images you included. But just an overall question of the many bone fragments you found. Is it challenging, or are there additional complexities to determining what type of trauma that bone went through than if you just, for instance, with Krista, found remains outside, laying outside in a state park? What's more complex about bones that have been burned?
Yeah, so you want to think about, right, what we talked about, the organic and the inorganic, right? So organic material is completely gone. So these are extremely fragile just because I have that inorganic material there, right? So those are the ones that give it a shape. But as soon as you hold those, sometimes they can crumble. So that's why we needed to be very careful. Obviously, the fire is masking some of those potential traumatic elements that I cannot see.
Okay. And so let's talk about some of the trauma maybe that you tried to observe or did observe. Let's talk about this vertebrae, for instance.
Yeah, so I know it might be a little bit difficult for you guys to see that as a vertebrae, but that is actually from the vertebrae itself, is those little pieces of bone that come out, right? So this is one of them. And then with my experience, right, and
What is
the way
that?
I know how that is supposed to
Missed
look,
it.
that is, as you can see, there was a transverse, there was a transecting horizontally cut, right? Because that is supposed to be pretty much round, right? So those are the two transverse processes that are going on the side of the vertebrae, right? So we have the vertebrae in the middle and those two on the side. So it seems like one of them was actually cut transversely.
Other than that, are there any conclusions you can draw from that?
No, there was too much damage. I can tell you that there was a cut there. I cannot tell you anything else because of the thermal damage. I use the arrows for you guys to kind of see what I'm talking about in terms of that straight cut.
Let's talk about this vertebrae on the next slide.
So again, this is a fragmented transverse process. So again, we're looking at the sides of the vertebrae itself. And I know what it's supposed to look like, right? So it's kind of round and has very round edges. And on this one, you can kind of see, so those two images are from different planes so that you can actually appreciate the cut itself, right? So those arrows that you can see are indicating the cut. And then on the other image, you can kind of see the border of it. That is almost, it is indicative of a cut mark.
Let's talk about the hands. Talk to me about this slide.
So this one was a very unique fragment of the lunate. So in your wrist, you have multiple bones here that consist of your wrist. One of them is called lunate because it resembles the moon. So I kind of put it up in that corner over there for you guys to kind of understand how it's supposed to look like. So in this case, lunate is supposed to be round, right? It's supposed to have all these shapes, and you can kind of see that there is a cut on it, right? That is not supposed to look like that, right? So it is, and it's very clean, right? Even though undergoing thermal damage, you can still see it. So yeah, you can see kind of the arrows over there where you can kind of see where that cut was made.
So like you can
were able to identify maybe more about the cut, right?
cut
In terms of the next
Oh,
image.
yes.
hands off.
So this is actually a fragmented distal end of the radius. So you have your hand, right? You have these, you have your wrist where you have several, little pieces of bone, and then you have your radius and you have your ulna. So we're looking at almost like this little bump over here, right? So that's what consists made of your radius and your
So
ulna.
think about
So
it.
what we're looking at
Touch
is
the
a little
hands
piece
off.
of bone that is supposed to be connecting.
Most
with your wrist,
likely.
right? And in this case, you can actually
Cut.
see, because this is a bigger bone, obviously it preserved a little bit better. And you can kind of see the
Head off.
cuts. Again, it's supposed to be a long bone. It's supposed to have a lot of shape. It's not supposed to be flat. And you can kind of see on those arrows over there where that actual cut was made.
And you say it's consistent with a chop mark.
Yes. So in this case,
This
the bone was big
probably
enough for me to
is
put it
dead
under the
because
microscope. And you can kind of see it
Probably
actually
didn't have to cut
without
up a
the
lot of
microscope.
his mom.
So in this one, it was very unique because it had unpatterned striations. So if you go back to Krista and Bart, right, we saw a lot of striations that were uneven, right? They were all over the place. And at times, it seems like it was very
His mom was
inconsistent.
short.
Those
That's why
characteristics
her
are consistent
torso
with what we saw,
wasn't
right?
found.
But when we're looking at
Which is
another type of
strange
tool,
why her legs
potentially a knife or something that
they
has a
couldn't
blade,
just-
we are looking for unpatterned striations.
Maybe he
So
just
we're
got
looking
tired.
we're thinking about the topography of
Didn't
the
want
tool
to.
itself,
Probably
right?
could have
So in
burned
this
all of
case,
her.
it was pretty much clean to the point that it actually created striations, but there's no pattern to the striations, right?
She
They're all
was
the same,
shorter.
right? So you have to, so in our field, that is consistent to be with a chop mark.
And if I go to the next slide, what are we looking at there?
Yeah, so here you can kind of see it a little bit better. So on to your left, that is just an
What
image, a
happens
photograph
when you get
from,
lazy?
taken with
He
our
just
camera.
got
And you
lazy.
can kind of see on those
Didn't-
arrows where those striations
Didn't finish what he
are. And if you can
started
see,
there.
it's very different from the other ones that I show you. This one, we don't have a pattern. They're all pretty much the same, right?
Is
So
my
that usually
guess. I
related or
don't
correlated
know.
with like a blade. And in this case, you can kind of see it also at the top as well. And then the image to your right, that is actually a microscopic image. And you can kind of see a little bit more of the unpatterned striations throughout the entire bone.
And we're talking about the wrist, correct?
Yeah, pretty much at this area over here.
And when you say chop marks, could that be consistent with a machete?
It could,
And could it be consistent with an axe?
yes,
You reached some conclusions here.
it did.
Talk to me about those.
So pretty much, as we all know by now, there was extreme fragmentation. And this is due to the fire, right? The thermal injuries. And they're mostly represented by that calcine bone, that white bone that I show you guys. And then we also have that charred black bone. There is compelling evidence of dismemberment here, even though we were not able to really pinpoint, again, like we did for Bart and Krista, how, what type of characteristics we can see because there was so much damage. We can definitely say, with the suspected distal end of the radius, that there was unpatterned striations, right, consistent with chop marks. 3 other fragments exhibited, that transecting, cut marks. But because of the damage, I was not able to really give you more information about it.
And I know you've been talking for a while, but this is my, last slide we're going to go through. You put some of your conclusions about what you found in this slide. Tell me about this and those numbers that you came to include on the slide.
Sure. So I just wanted to kind of give you an overall sense of what we found, right? So we found a total of 106 fragments of bone that were able to be identified. From those 106, 53 of them were considered to be on the cranium. When I'm saying cranium, I'm talking about skull and also mandible. And then we were able to identify 18 of them as hands, part of the hands, 24 of them as dental fragments, and 8 of them as vertebrae, and 3 of them as long bones. In addition to that, I had 124 fragments that I know they're bone, but I was unable to identify them. So we had a grand total of 230 bones.
So, okay. So I would say he burned the face, the hands, I don't know why the knees. Like the upper legs, maybe? And then got rid of, because I guarantee you, because if they didn't find any like rib bones or pelvic bones or anything of the lower spine, I bet you mom and even dad, probably that part of them, I don't know, they could be, that could have burned up, but who knows? I wonder if mom's like torso's out there somewhere. Man, Chandler, just say the shit. Like, say what you did.
Fragmented bones that were found.
I got too many
again,
questions.
inside the fireplace, on the grate, and also on the ash disposal area.
Nothing further. Cross-examination?
Thank you. Good morning, or good afternoon now, I think. Starting sort of where we left off with those bone fragments found at the home. I think I heard you say that you could identify whether they were human or not. Let's start there.
That's correct.
So some of the things you found, for whatever reason, you could not identify as human. Some you could identify as human.
That is correct.
Now, some of them you also were able to determine came from an adult human. Is that right?
Some of the fragments did have features of an adult.
Now, none of the fragments that you found could tell you whether it was a male or a female adult human, correct?
That is correct.
And despite the number of bone fragments you found,
It
you
was
weren't
a
able to
human
determine if they came
in a
from one
fireplace
human or
in a
6 different
home.
humans, correct?
That is correct.
Now, turning back to your analysis from the
It's not
beginning of your
reasonable
testimony,
doubt.
you were given a couple of tools to compare with the evidence that you found. Is that right?
That is correct.
So the total number of tools you were given was 2. Is that right?
Yes.
And you were able to say that what you found was consistent with those tools, but you couldn't say that those tools were the actual tools that caused those marks, correct?
That is correct.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Any redirect? And may this witness be excused?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
It was consistent with those tools, but it couldn't say for 100% certainty that it was those tools. But it could have been those tools. You're not putting doubt in anybody's mind. You're just making yourself look stupid. Stupid lady. I think you look stupid. And if I was a juror, I would be calling you stupid. That's what I would be calling you. I don't know. I think this is the next one. Oh my God.
Break. Anyone who's exposed to conversations, engaged in conversations, or otherwise researched or learned or sought information about the case. Yes, thanks very much. Continue with the state's case. If you call your witness, please.
State calls Andrew
Very
Smith.
much.
Mr. Smith, do you believe you could testify safely and responsibly without wearing a mask? That would be our preference if you can. Yes, sir. Go ahead and remove your mask then. And next I'll ask you to please stand so that the...
Oh, this is dude's friend.
You solemnly swear for the testimony about to give this matter the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Yes, ma'am.
Dude's friend from Germany.
Hold the microphone
Well,
back up nice and close.
Good
Army.
afternoon, sir. Could you please state your name and then spell it out so everyone who's taking notes just knows how it's spelled?
Andrew Smith,
How do you spell it?
Alpha, November, Delta, Romeo, Echo, Whiskey.
And your last name, Smith. How am I spelling?
Sierra, Mike, India, Tango, Hotel.
And
Well,
how
you're
old
an
are you?
idiot.
22, sir.
And what area of the country do you live in?
Kansas, sir.
Do you know someone by the name of Chandler Halderson?
Yes, sir.
How did you meet Chandler Halderson?
Playing video games while stationed in Germany, sir.
And do you see Mr. Halderson in the courtroom here today?
Yes, sir.
What's going to happen here is the judge is going to give some instructions, and then I'm going to ask you where he is. So wait 1 second.
I would ask everyone who's not in the jury box to lower their masks for just a short moment so that all faces are observed by the witness. You can replace your masks. Thank you.
Did you see Mr. Halderson here in the courtroom?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell me where he's sitting and kind of what he's wearing?
We're on the right turn to seat.
Yeah, very good.
Awesome.
Good identification.
Germany were you stationed?
On Spock, sir.
And whereabout is that?
Middle of BFE, sir.
And how did you decide to live in Wisconsin while you were in Germany?
Playing video games
Middle
on Armed
of
Forces, sir.
BFE.
And what type of video games were you playing?
Mostly FPS, sir.
What type of game is that?
So go around, complete objectives, and capture certain scenarios, sir.
Is it a shooting game?
Yes, sir.
And some people in the jury maybe play video games, other people don't. If you had to explain to someone how you end up meeting someone playing a video game, could you describe how that happens?
So you'll connect to a server, and then you can type in voice channels or type in voice channels. You can type in text channels, meet people. You can die by other players and interact through them like that by just typing them, or if you guys get in a voice altercation at safe zones where some players can't necessarily hurt each other.
Okay. And so how about did you end up meeting Chandler? Was he just in one of these games and you talked to him?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did you talk to him a lot?
Yes, sir.
Did you develop a friendship?
Yes, sir.
About what time was this? What year was this?
I want to say it was 2019 or 2018. It was shortly after my son was born, sir.
And how often, if you just had to give us a general overview, how often would you play video games with Chandler online?
Almost every day, sir.
And would you be talking and communicating during that time period?
Yes, sir.
At some point, you start to learn a lot about Chandler, I would imagine.
Yes.
Okay. Did you have any idea of, at the time, kind of what he was doing in life, school, work, anything like that?
As far as I knew, he was going to college in one of the towns somewhere in Wisconsin and doing all that.
At some point, you end up coming back to the United States.
Yes, sir.
Military service was over?
Something like that, sir.
Okay. At any point while you were in the military toward the end of your service, did you suffer
Something
any
like that,
yourself?
sir.
Yes, sir. In Germany, and I was coming off the 50 cal range in a German total Humvee, and I got in a Humvee wreck. So I slammed my forehead on a hard side wall of the vehicle, unfortunately. So
You got a head injury.
essentially, sir.
Okay. Were you talking to Mr.
That's
Halderson around this time
unfortunate.
between that head injury when you came back to the United
Yes, sir.
States? When you came back to the United States, what state did you move to or live in?
Kansas, sir.
Is that your home?
For now.
Okay. Had you ever spent much time in Wisconsin before?
No, sir.
Why are you so
After you
vague
moved
in
back
your
to
answers?
Wisconsin or to the United States,
You're such
did
a
your
smart
frequency of
ass.
playing video games with Mr. Halderson, did it increase, decrease, stay the same?
Increase, sir. I was in the same time zone.
And would you continue to play the same types of games?
Yes, sir.
Is there any specific weapons that Mr. Halderson liked when he's playing these games?
It really depended on what we were playing. On Tarkov, or Escape from Tarkov is what the game is called. It would range from realistically to whatever we could find inside the video game, because not everything was necessarily easily to collect, but the SKS was certainly a weapon that was fun to use in Tarkov and was something that I had grown interest in as well.
And around this time, after you came back to the United States, did you learn anything more about where Mr. Halderson was in life? Had jobs changed, school changed, or was things the same for him?
Essentially, what I understood was he was still going to college, and he at some point had gone back to Windsor, or I think it's called Windsor, and had started working for some company installing solar panels or working on contracts for solar panels.
At any point in your discussions with Mr. Halderson, did he get another job, or was that the last job you knew him having?
As far as I know, that was it, sir.
At some point, you decided to come visit Chandler.
Yes, sir.
When about
During, I think it was June, sir.
this past year?
Yes.
He's the ray of fucking
And
sunshine.
generally,
guy.
how did that come about? Did he ask you to come up? Did you just decide to come?
Those
Ugh.
not decisions I was able to make, sir. So my wife had going to the family in Ohio, and I went and looked at how many points I had. I was able to take off work, and I went and called for that just so I could come up and have a weekend with driving up there and then spending 2 days with him, sir.
Had you ever been to Wisconsin before?
No, sir.
It's a long drive up here.
No shit.
Okay, everyone slips up. I'm showing you what's been marked.
He
In this
said
case,
no
there's
shit.
exhibit number 392. Is that you and Chandler up here?
Yes, sir.
And I'll just move 392 in evidence. I'll just show it to the jury if that's okay, Judge.
Any objection?
No objection.
It's received. You may publish.
Where'd you stay when you were up here with Mr. Halderson?
In
Did you meet his
No
parents?
shit.
yes, sir.
When you were up here, kind of things did you do for fun? Where'd you go?
So we went swimming at some river at some point, and then we went and drove around to the different department stores, and we're looking at weapons and all that. So we went to Cabela's. We went to, I want to say it was Bass Pro, but that doesn't sound right. I know we went to Gander Mountain, and then we went to like one or two other places, but I can't remember what they were.
Showing you a photograph labeled
That's
exhibit number 563. Did you take that picture?
Yes, sir.
And what is that?
The river, sir.
That you went swimming?
Yes, sir.
And who took you there?
Chandler and his girlfriend at the time.
I'll move 563 in evidence.
No objection.
It is received.
And I asked to publish on the Elmo. Actually, it's not set up right now. I'm just going to show everybody. Was that a river or a lake swimming in?
River, sir.
And was there a city across the street or across the river from there?
Yes, sir. And the river on the right.
Having never been to Wisconsin before, you don't know exactly what river that was or where you were?
I'm just here, sir.
How long
I'm
did you
just
stay
here,
with
sir.
Chandler and the family when you came to visit?
So I got up there on Saturday morning, right around 5 a.m., I think, and then I stayed
don't know
there.
where I
until
am or what
Sunday
I'm doing,
evening
I'm just
around
here, sir.
1700, and then went and departed and was able to arrive back home on Monday around 2 or 4 in the morning, somewhere between, sir.
When you visited Wisconsin with Chandler, you brought him a gift.
Yes, sir.
What did you bring?
I brought him a 20-inch barrel SKS.
How did you acquire this gun?
So I had purchased it on a gun broker, and I went and had it sent to my FL, and then I went and sat in the FL, and so I went and did the FL transfer. So I purchased it initially because I was like, oh, well, I like it in the video game, I might like it in real life, and then I fired it, sat in my safe, and then I never touched it again. And then it just dawned on me like, well, I'm gonna give it to someone who might actually appreciate this weapon and take care of it and all that. So I ended up giving it to Chandler as a gift.
Okay. So while you like guns, you didn't particularly love this gun.
No, sir.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as exhibit number 391. You know what that document is?
Yes, sir. It's a FFL transfer paperwork, sir.
And you've been saying the phrase FFL, correct?
Yes.
What does that mean?
That's a federal firearms license holder.
Meaning someone who's licensed to sell firearms and fills out
Yes,
paperwork.
and does the correct background checks and such.
I'll move 391 into evidence.
No objection.
It is received.
This document has your signature on it and the person who sold it, their signature, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it has the serial number of the weapon that you purchased.
Yes, sir.
Got it. Now, when you gave the gun to Chandler, did he pay you for it?
No, sir.
It was a gift.
Yes, sir.
Did you document in any way transferring that gun to him?
Yes, sir.
How did you choose? Did you fill out paperwork like this?
I took his photo ID that the state issued him, and I took it right next to the serial number, annotating that this was me giving this weapon to this individual. So that way, if anything like this would occur, that it wouldn't necessarily come back to me.
Okay. It was important to you to document that.
Most times it is, yes.
Okay. So I'm showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 393, 394, and then maybe a more zoomed in version, which is 564. Do those all appear to be just general versions of what you did there?
Yes, sir.
And so these are Chandler's driver's license and the serial number of that weapon.
Yes, sir.
All right. I'll move 393, 394, and 564 into evidence.
No objection.
They are received.
And I'll publish them to the jury just by showing it, if that's fine with everyone. Oh. So I'm showing
In
first this
case
one.
anybody
Chandler's
goes
ID.
all
Can you put up the serial number?
murdery.
Yes, sir.
Then same thing.
Yes.
And then the actual serial number zoomed in a little bit closer.
Yes, sir.
Can you read the serial number
I
for us
don't
of
Get
this
in
gun from this
trouble.
Yes, sir. 101794855. Papa.
So 101794855. Pete, Paul. Okay. Had Chandler asked you for this gun, or was this just your idea?
I think he had at one point asked for it as a joke, but mostly it was my idea, sir.
You brought him other things that go with the gun?
Yes, sir.
What type of things?
So I brought him a steel canister that had contained roughly 480 rounds of 7.62 by 39 steel case tool ammo.
And is that the ammunition that goes with that weapon?
Yes, sir.
And showing you what's been marked, exhibit 395, 396, 397. Those appear to be that canister of ammunition.
Yes, sir.
And are you fairly confident that's the one you brought?
Well, I mean, I'm the only weirdo that stencils his ammo can, so yes.
You put those stencils on there.
Yes, sir.
All right, so I move 397, 395, and 396 into evidence.
No objection.
They are received.
And I'll move to publish to 396. And so showing the jury this picture, when you say you stencil this ammo can, what do you mean by that?
So I've got plenty of different kinds of rounds in my home. So I go and have different cans for them, and I take a spray can, I'll buy the stencil so I can make sure I know what I'm grabbing if I need something before I go to the range, so I'm not running around like a chicken with my head cut off trying to figure out what can goes to what.
So this yellow paint that says 762 by 39, that's you that stenciled that on there.
Yes, sir.
I'm the only weirdo that does that.
And briefly, just showing you exhibit number 398, 399, 400, 401. Do all of those appear to be the ammunition that was inside of that can?
Yes, sir.
All right, I'll move 398 through 401,
No objection.
They are received.
and I'd move to publish. I'll publish just for purposes of just showing the jury something, 398 and 400.
Very good.
And these are just those ammunition.
Yes, sir.
Okay. There was a lot of ammunition.
A bit.
It appears that way.
How did Chandler react when you gave him the gun?
Oh, he was happy.
What do you mean? How do you know he was happy? Or how do you know that?
He had a big smile on his face when I had given it to him as a gift.
Were you aware whether his parents that he was living with were gun people or wanted guns in their home?
As far as I knew that, or what was explained by Chandler, was that his parents understood the reason why firearms exist in this world. And not that they necessarily support having them, but they're helpful in situations.
To your knowledge, did Chandler have any guns?
As far as I knew, he told me that he had owned a AR-15 with a barrel extension that had to be welded on or something like that. And it was kind of looked like an M16 almost.
Did you ever see that gun?
He had shown me a picture of it on the app called Discord, but I don't have any documentation of that.
When you were here in Wisconsin, did you ever see guns in the Halderson house?
I think I asked about it, but I think he said that they had it at the wherever their cabin was.
What did Chandler do with the gun? Were you able to figure out where he put it in the house?
Yeah, he had initially. So if you walk down the flight stairs in the basement, you would look left. There was like a little wood pile, and he had stuck it in the middle section there because it was. I understood that they might not be happy about having this firearm. So, but he had told me he was going to be moving soon to do a career in SpaceX in Florida. So he was just going to take it with him and move out there with it.
Were there any magazines that came with the gun?
Yes, sir.
How many?
3.
And those all went with that gun.
Yes, sir.
Were they loaded when you gave them to him?
Not initially, sir.
How did they become loaded?
I think we were bullshitting with the magazine, sir, and both of us were like, he was asking me how to load it. So I was like, oh, you just, and I was showing him how to pack the magazine.
Aside from, and I think we've got it, but aside from the gun, the 3 magazines, the ammo can, and then the 400 some rounds of ammunition, was there anything else related to the gun that you gave to Chandler?
The optic that came on the weapon.
The sight, if for most people. If people aren't gun people, what's an optic?
It's the same thing, essentially.
If I showed you that gun, would you recognize it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You're not going to touch it. The detectives, in fact, are going to touch it, but it's already been receiving evidence.
Roger.
In this case.
Roger. It's like, can I have my gun back now? Elmo. He needs the Elmo.
So this is Detective Shunk, who I think you met in this case. Does that appear to be a weapon that you gave to Chandler?
Can you flip it over? Yes.
And looking at this zoomed-in picture of the serial number from the driver's license photo, stand up if you need to. Would you confirm to me if that's the serial number, in fact, on that weapon?
Perhaps.
Yes.
I think just because you weren't speaking into the microphone, because I asked you to stand up, that last response was yes, that is the serial number.
Yes, sir.
The magazines themselves, would you recognize those if you saw them?
Yes, sir.
How so?
Well, I don't remember. My brain doesn't always work correctly sometimes, but I can remember most things for firearms. So I know 2 of them should be made by ProMag, and then one has a metal bottom with some black screwed up something on it.
When you gave Chandler the 3 magazines, and obviously there's 1 gun, but there's 3 magazines, there's a good deal of ammunition, several hundred rounds. Were
400,
were you
480.
480. Were you giving him everything you had related to that gun?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did you have any reason to keep any of the other things?
No, sir.
Okay. Just 1 second, we're going to show you some other stuff.
Gotcha.
Roger. Roger, good buddy.
And this might take a second.
You know, the way the state described him is you might not like a lot of the things that he says or the way he says them.
And again, you'll notice the detective's wearing gloves, so he'll show you anything, and he'll turn things around if you ask him. He'll have to ask you not to touch anything.
Roger.
I don't mind him.
Just so the jury knows, because of the break that we had in suspending the trial, I asked the detectives to reseal all of the evidence boxes since we weren't going to be able to access them for a number of days, and that's the process that's happening at this time.
Also, now they got to recut open all of the boxes that we sat here and watched and cut open the first time.
And so, just keep that box over.
Well, that's what Steven told me.
Showing you what's been marked as 288. Does that appear to be a magazine consistent with what you gave Mr. Halderson?
Yes, sir.
And what defining
Sir, don't
characteristics on
touch
that
it.
magazine that lead you to believe that is in fact one you gave him?
The big ugly splotch on the bottom of the magazine, sir.
And I'll have the detective display that for the jury. All right, and so we're going to do the same process with the next 2. And the next exhibit we're going to deal with is 289.
He's in different glasses. These lights killing my eyes. Oh my God. It is too much. We're doing too much, sir. I want you to know.
Again, same process. We're showing you 289. You can ask that be moved any way you'd like. Does that appear to be consistent with the magazine that you gave Chandler Halderson?
Yes, sir.
And would that fit into the SKS rifle that you just looked at?
Yes, sir.
We'll go to the next one. And while the detective's pulling up the next one, the last one, which I can touch the outside, is exhibit 288. You yourself have fired this gun in the past.
Yes, sir.
Are you aware exactly how much ammunition you gave to Chandler?
Yes, sir.
How much?
The box ammo that I purchased had 500 rounds in it, sir. I've shot roughly 20. Didn't enjoy the firearm and gave him 480 rounds.
And when you say 480, is that an estimate, or do you know that to be exact?
That should be precise.
While you were here in Wisconsin, Chandler, did you all fire the weapon?
No, sir.
What are we looking at now? I got bored. Another magazine? Dear God.
Showing you that exhibit. You can ask for it to be moved any way you'd like.
Yes, sir.
Is that consistent with the magazine you gave Chandler?
Yes, sir.
Hallelujah.
Did you discuss with Chandler when you gave him the weapon in June of this past year? Anything more about what he's going to do with it other than I think you said he's going to move to Florida with his new job? Anything else? Did you discuss? Was he going to go hunting? Anything like that?
I don't believe so, sir.
You said you visited him over the course of a couple of days. Did you give it to him right away or later on in the weekend?
I think it was either Sunday that I gave it to him or it was someday on Saturday that I gave it to him.
After you gave it to him and he placed it, I think you said was under boards.
It was so it was almost like a bench like this, but there's a hollow center that had stuff stacked inside of it, and he just kind of shoved it in there since there was stuff blocking the front path of it from view.
Do you know where? Did the gun ever come out after he put it in there? Did you ever see it again?
We could have, sir. I think we could have played around with it, just showing how it works. And like, keep in mind, I had this weapon for a couple months, just had it sit in my safe, so I've had plenty of time to figure out a little bit of the ins and outs of it. So
Did he place? Do you know where Chandler placed the magazines or the ammo box?
I don't recall, sir.
Did Chandler tell you anything more about his job at SpaceX?
Not really, sir. Just that he had an opportunity that he was looking forward to.
You left at some point and you continued talking to Chandler playing video games after you went back home?
Yes, sir.
At some point, did Chandler suffer some sort of injury?
Yes, sir.
do
As
you know
far
about
as I
that?
know, he went down the stairs and had fell somehow and screwed up his head or his neck.
And did that injury, according to Chandler, did that end up impacting his job or anything like that?
As far as I knew, so it seemed that because of that injury, he wasn't going to be able to take a flight out to Florida to do this SpaceX thing. But other than that, he didn't really explain what was wrong, just that he wasn't going to be able to fly out there and he wasn't able to look at computer screens or anything like that with so much blur on the screen or motion blur.
Did you find out at some point that Chandler's parents were missing?
Yes, sir.
How did you find out?
It was shortly after the 4th of July when I came back from Texas from visiting my other buddy. He had gave me a sort of, not hysterical per se, but a pretty upsetting call that his parents hadn't got back to him or he hadn't seen them.
And in the cadence of things, was this was after the head injury?
Yes, sir.
Did Chandler tell you anything about the head injury in terms of specifics about what was going to happen? Or
He told me that he would have to wear a neck brace and that they were supposed to drill a hole in his head or something like that to alleviate some sort of pressure.
Did you talk to Chandler about this?
Lies.
Yes, sir.
Tell me about those conversations.
Well, day one when he told us, because he had told me and my friend that he's friends with that I visited when I was down in Texas, he told us that they'd been missing. So we both suggested to him that, hey, if this is really a big concern for you, you might want to contact law enforcement immediately.
What did Chandler say to that?
He said, well, they might turn up, so I'll just wait a few days, and so it goes.
After that conversation, do you recall having any other conversations with Chandler about his parents being missing?
Just talking about how or where they could end up it or what was going on with the situation.
Was Chandler expressing worry to you or that he was concerned?
He seemed concerned, yes.
Not too concerned.
At some point, sure, and obviously now you're aware that Chandler was arrested for what happened.
Yes, sir.
You began having to have some conversations with
What?
him because a gun that was found.
Is that why I'm here?
Bart Halderson, Chandler's father, was that gun that we just showed you. And so law enforcement started talking to you, right?
Yes, sir. Well, I'd reached out to them immediately upon figuring out that he had been arrested.
You've been cooperative with law enforcement the whole time, haven't you?
I'm not going to be a broken piece of glass, sir.
Meaning you'll help if you need to.
Yes.
The police, in fact, visited you
Broken
down in
piece.
your
What does
where you
that
live at some point.
Yes, sir.
You, when asked, have given them access to things like bank records or your phone and things of that sort.
Yes, sir.
And you provided photographs whenever you could.
Yes, sir.
Why was that important to you to assist?
Well, to put it bluntly, sir, I served in the Army, and I'm not going to get fucked for something that I didn't do.
Where were you? July 1st, July 2nd, 2021.
Crystal Beach, Texas, sir.
In fact, what is Exhibit
They
566?
use the
Looks like
F
my bank
word.
statement, sir.
And where's that bank statement show that you are?
So if you follow this down, so you can see that I went and did
He
some
was
sort of
in
purchase at a gas station at
Texas.
Texas at 702. Then follow this down, 702 Lufkin, Texas. Then keep following it down. You can see 702 Crystal Beach, Texas. Keep following it down. You can see Lufkin again, sir. And then Crystal Beach, sir. And then more purchases at Crystal Beach, Texas, sir. And then a few interspersed things that my wife had been purchasing at Dollar Tree, apparently.
And where was she at?
She was in Manhattan, still, sir, or Junction City, sir.
Junction City. And in all of these purchases, and this is a bank statement from the 1st, looks like through the 10th, there's not a single one from Wisconsin, correct?
No, sir.
Nothing from Illinois,
No, sir.
Iowa,
No, sir.
Minnesota?
Unless I have the power of God to teleport, sir, I don't think that's going to occur.
Understood. I'll move 566 into evidence.
Any
No
objection?
objection.
It's received.
I don't think it needs to be published. Your bank statements can
Has
just be right there.
information been redacted?
They have been redacted if
All
ultimately.
you can see is how broke I am.
That's fine. And in fact, at times, you're aware that the police verified your location in other ways. Phone records.
That's rude.
You were never
Don't publish my bank account.
No, sir.
I do not consent.
Thank you, sir.
Cross-examination?
Good afternoon, Mr. Smith.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
I'd like to first ask you a few questions about that SKS that you purchased. Is it correct that you purchased that initially for yourself?
Yes, sir. Or ma'am, sorry.
Is it fair to say you're interested in guns?
In firearms, yes, ma'am.
You said you went and fired that SKS maybe 20 times.
I had shot it once and put 20 rounds through the rifle itself through my hands, ma'am.
After that, you decided it wasn't that appealing to you.
No, ma'am. Just too much kick, too much of anything that didn't make me happy about the weapon.
What do you mean by too much kick?
So each caliber of weapon or bullet will fire X amount of powder through it. So for example, the SKS, which shoots 7.62 by 39 or whatever it is in Russia, it shoots a bigger payload of powder versus 5.56/223, which shoots up to 27 grains of powder. So it's not as much kick, but you can still put enough firepower down range.
Why does the kick make it unappealing to you?
Because if I had to defend my family from a home intruder, I think 5.56 is going to be a lot easier and a lot faster for me to react with than a 7.62 by 39 rounds.
Compared
She
to
doesn't
other
understand
guns
anything
or
you just
firearms
said.
that you've used, the SKS is somewhat louder than similar type firearms, correct?
Not necessarily. It depends. It really depends on a lot of things along where the location is. If you're in let's say you're shooting it in here, it's going to be loud as hell because there's all the encasing around you. If you're outside, it's going to be not as loud, but it's still going to be pretty loud.
Louder than a handgun.
Not necessarily.
Under similar circumstances, louder than a handgun.
Possibly. Yes.
Now you're familiar with your familiarity with firearms. You're familiar with the terms of flash suppressor or flash hider.
Yes, ma'am.
And what are those?
So a flash hider, depending on what you have, it can make either the ball flame that comes out of it a lot bigger. It can make it so when you're shooting or at a prone position, when you're firing, the weapon gets pulled forward versus sending the recoil back, so it's not as much. And it really depends on what you're talking about specifically. You can't just throw a flash hider in with one of the other things because they all do different things.
Potentially, they could also reduce the sound.
Not necessarily unless you have a suppressor.
So a flash suppressor can reduce the sound.
A flash suppressor, if you can go out and buy a suppressor with a tack stamp, yes.
So could any kind of silencer.
Yes, ma'am.
And you didn't provide any of those with this SKS when you
No, ma'am,
gifted it
but
to
with
Mr.
the
Halderson.
SKS's barrel at the end of it, regardless, it's kind of an act of God almost to put a suppressor on. So there's barrel threading, which was not on this SKS at the end of it. There might be a special attachment you can get and purchase and put onto this firearm, but unless you have certain special attachments, it might not necessarily fit in correctly or seat correctly, which can cause problems itself and cause an obstruction.
Bottom line, though, this SKS that you gifted Mr. Halderson didn't have any of that.
No, ma'am. It's the standard end of an AK-74, essentially.
Now, when you gifted this SKS to Mr. Halderson, you talked about this procedure you use with taking a photo of someone's driver's license with the serial number from the firearm. Do you
Yes,
remember
ma'am.
that? That's not something you only have done with Mr. Halderson. It's something you've done anytime you've sold, transferred, or gifted firearms, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And you've done that several times?
Yes, ma'am.
How many?
Depends on a lot of things. If I have, so I can have an AR-15 that I'll buy and I'll build it and then it'll sit in my safe for whatever reason for a long time. And then I can be like, oh, okay, well, go and sell it. But as for how many I've sold, that's none of your business, frankly.
Okay. That's really
All
all I
right.
have. Thank you.
Any redirect? May this witness be excused and released.
He is both, yes.
Thank you, sir. Have a good
Yes.
rest of your day. Thank you. And the next witness, please.
That is none of your business, frankly. I mean, I like to.
I believe you can.
None of your business.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Go right ahead.
Mind your
Good afternoon.
business.
Please state and spell your name for the record.
Greetings. My name is Clint, C-L-I-N-T.
Greetings,
My last name is
Clint.
Seltzner, S-E-L-T-Z-N-E-R.
And what do you do for a living, sir?
I'm a detective for the Dane County Sheriff's Office
How long have you been a detective?
since August of 2015.
Were you yourself involved in the investigation into the homicides? Department Crystal Halderson specifically into the search of their home on Oak Springs.
Yes, I was.
In what capacity were you involved in that search?
I was just one of the detectives assigned to help search.
And particularly, did you end up searching Chandler Halderson's bedroom?
Yes, I did.
What gave you the impression that that was Chandler's bedroom?
Oh no.
The pictures on the wall, the size of the clothes, documents, things like that.
When you searched the bedroom, were you searching for any items in particular, or were you just looking through and seeing what you could find?
I think at that point we were just looking for anything we thought that could be related to the case.
And were cell phones an important item for you to look for at that time?
Yes, they were.
That was included in the search warrant of things that you could take from the Halderson home?
Yes, I was.
I'll show you a couple photographs. Showing what's been marked as exhibit 469. What's that a photograph of?
I see Apple iPhones, an iPod, I believe, and then there's also a black and silver Apple iPhone.
And I'm showing you 470 with some of those items pulled up, correct?
Yes.
There were numerous phones in Chandler Halderson's bedroom that were seized as evidence.
Yes, there were.
Were these photographs of those phones in those general areas?
Yes, they were. This is an Alcatel flip phone.
Sure. So at least were these all found in the same general vicinity?
Yeah, these phones were found, the Apple iPhone was found in a desk drawer, and where you would put your legs underneath the workspace, there's that fold-out drawer where typically pens and things like that are found. That's where that was. The Alcatel phone was found in the bottom drawer.
Same desk?
Same desk.
Okay. So a couple different phones, and then just some general USBs, normal office stuff in there, correct?
That's right.
All right. I'll move 469 and 470 to evidence.
No objection.
They are received.
And then before I publish, did you find any ammunition or ammunition cans in the bedroom?
Yes, I did.
Whereabouts was an ammunition can found?
The ammunition can was found in the closet on the right-hand side on the floor.
Showing it's been marked as exhibit number 471. Is that the ammunition can?
Yes, it is.
And is that kind of where it was found?
It was in the
Ammunition
closet. I
can?
can't really see it from the context.
Things are moved around here. Take a photograph at the top.
Yeah, that's the ammo can.
So 471 moved.
Any objection to the receipt of 471?
No objection.
It is received.
All right. I'll move to publish.
These items should show up on the computer monitor.
And we're just going to show them here because there's not many, and the detail perhaps isn't as important as some, but is that the ammunition can there in the center of 471?
Yes, sir.
And you said that was in Mr. Halderson's closet?
Yes, it was.
469, is that a photograph of the top drawer of that desk?
It looks like it, yes.
And we have some phones that became relevant that you ended up seizing,
Yes.
and other just general debris. And then if we look at 470, is that laid out all the phones that were collected from that desk?
Yes.
And then obviously there's just appears to be some normal office things, but we have a flip phone kind of in the center right, and then appears to be two iPhones,
I believe one was an iPod.
iPod and an iPhone.
Yeah, I believe so.
And all those items were seized?
Yes.
Look at this photograph. I can't help it. Every time I say look at the photographs,
Where are
every
the gloves
time I
from?
hear it,
Mr. Halderson's bedroom.
that's just what I say.
Detective Liz
That's
Allen
what I
located
hear.
a glove in the drawer of his nightstand. That was a black glove. And then I found a box of Walgreens exam-style gloves in a container or box underneath the bed.
Oh,
Exam style
no.
gloves, the gloves that we've maybe been wearing in court, the plastic gloves, the latex gloves?
Right.
Okay. And did you
Why does
seize
he
that
have
box of gloves?
those?
Yes, we did.
I'm showing it's been marked. We don't have to open it. 474, is that in fact the box of gloves that you seized that day? Yes.
Yes, it is.
I'll move to 474 in
That's
evidence.
No objection.
It is received.
That box of gloves, had it been
Excuse
opened and
me.
had some taken out, or do you recall?
I can't remember for certain.
And those phones that we previously talked about, one flip phone and one iPhone found in the drawer, were those seized by yourself, or others involved in the search of his bedroom?
We were seized, yeah, but they were seized by detectives, yes.
Showing exhibit number 567, does that appear to be the Apple iPhone?
Yes, it does.
And I'm showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 473. This is just labeled as what?
Labeled a cell phone.
Okay. And in fact, we're going to open these. So we'll have one of the detectives bring up, don't think there's any scissors up here, so we'll have them bring something up to open those.
Did we move those two into evidence? Or do you have to, are you moving based on on testimony regarding the labels?
We'll open them up first.
Or after that? Okay.
So we'll start with 473, labeled as cell phone. If you want to open that up for us. What do we got there?
This is an Alcatel flip phone.
Okay. And you're not here to tell us what's on the phone, but it's a flip phone.
Yes.
And consistent with what you seized in Mr. Halderson's room in his desk drawer.
Yes, it is.
All right, I'll move 473 in evidence.
No objection.
It is received.
All right, same thing. We'll look at this one, labeled in this case 567. If you can open that up, let us know what we're looking at. What do we got there?
This is a black and silver Apple iPhone.
And was that the phone found in the top desk drawer in Chandler Halderson's bedroom?
Yes, it was.
All right. Take that back, and I will move 567 in evidence.
No objection.
It is received.
And don't go too quick or too far here. While we're here, these are the gloves I think we already talked about. It's 474 moving to evidence. If you just open those up so everyone can take a look. And is that box of gloves open?
Yes, it is.
And what's it labeled?
Nitrile exam gloves
From Walgreens?
from Walgreens.
All right, we can place it back in. Okay. Thank you. We have one more to look at. Is that ammunition can? An all ammunition collected?
Yes, it was.
That box, I'll say exhibit number 475 down. Does that appear to be the ammunition that's collected from Mr. Halderson's bedroom?
Yes, it does. Yes, it is.
And is it appropriately marked with an exhibit sticker as well as a Dane County Sheriff's evidence sticker?
I recognize that evidence ID number and the sticker.
All right, I'd move 475.
No objection.
It is received.
And if you could just open it up so we can take a look at it. All right, and what I'm gonna have you do is just pull that out, if you could, and hold up so the jury can see the stencil side of that. It says 7.62 by 39. Is that full of ammunition right now?
Yes, it is.
It's very heavy, isn't it? Okay, we'll put it back. Just looking for a place to sit this one. Regarding those phones that we talked about that were seized, you're not the person who does the analysis of those phones, right?
No, I'm not.
You took them, they got put in the bag, they put in evidence, and that's what you're testifying to?
Yes.
No further questions.
No, thank you.
May this witness be excused?
No, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Remain your day.
State now calls Alex Gravatt to the stand.
Alex Grovat. Who you be, sir? Oh, look at him. He's got a man.
Good afternoon. I've been asking every witness if they believe they can safely and responsibly testify without wearing a mask, that they should do so if they're comfortable with that.
I would prefer to keep mine on if that's okay.
That's fine.
Thank you very much.
Go right ahead.
Good afternoon. Could you please state your first and last name and spell both for the record?
I am Alex Gravatt, AlexGravatt.
Mr. Gravatt, do you know somebody by the name of Chandler Halderson?
I do know Chandler Halderson.
And how do you know Mr. Halderson?
We were childhood friends and roommates.
Okay. I'd ask that you look around the courtroom. The judge will give instructions in just a second and tell me whether or not you see Mr. Halderson.
And before the witness does so, would everybody not in the jury box lower their mask for a moment so that he can see everyone's faces? Thank you. You can replace your masks. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I see Chandler Halderson.
Could you please identify him by where he's located and perhaps the color of his shirt?
He is wearing a black suit with a white shirt next to somebody wearing green.
Okay. Next, the record reflect that the witness has identified Mr. Halderson.
It shall.
Mr. Gravatt, did you ever go swimming in the Wisconsin River with Mr. Halderson?
Yes, a handful of times.
Okay. And where did you guys go? Could you describe the location?
We had two spots, one next to a local park in Saukville, and then one kind of down the road across a bridge, and we had to go into a cul-de-sac and then down a winding path through a little prairie to a beach.
And that second location you described, how many times do you think you went there with Mr. Halderson?
Me personally, 2 or 3. I know that they went, he and a few of my other friends went more times without me.
Was it your understanding that Mr. Halderson knew how to scuba dive?
Yes.
What did you know about his scuba diving?
Well, I knew in high school he was a diver, but then he loved to swim, and from my understanding, he joined the Madison police diving team for search and rescue missions. I know he'd gone a few times with them, to my knowledge, but I never went with him or dropped him off or saw anything.
Did he ever tell you about any of his search and rescue missions?
Yes, he told me a couple of times about getting caught in riptides, and one time he said that he saw a body while doing it, while scuba diving, and that he was a little weirded out by that.
Did he ever bring home any mementos or anything he found while scuba diving?
Yes, I know there was one time he brought home a large pink sex toy that he found, and then there was one time I believe he brought home like an old rusty-looking knife.
And were these from his scuba diving missions with the Madison Police Department? Was that your understanding?
I believe so.
No further questions.
Any cross-examination?
No, thank you.
May this witness be excused and released.
Yes, Your Honor.
So where the hell did he get these weird things? You just
State will call
found them on
the
the
witness stand.
side of the road. A weird pink sex toy. This kid's weird as hell.
Good afternoon. I've been asking every witness if they believe they can safely and responsibly do so to testify without wearing a mask. If that. Thank you. Go right.
Dakota Brown, DAKOTAH BROWN.
Oh, you be.
Yes,
How do you know Mr. Halderson?
I was in a relationship with him for 1 year.
And I'd ask
Oh.
that the judge will give instructions in a minute,
Next.
but I'd ask that that you look around the courtroom, see if you see Mr. Halderson, and then identify him by where he's seated and perhaps the color of his shirt.
I'll ask everyone not in the jury box to lower their mask for a brief moment. Thank you. You could return your masks. Were you able to see Mr. Halderson?
Yes, white shirt, black tie, blue mask.
And is he seated at a table?
Yes.
I'd ask the record to reflect the witnesses identified the defendant.
It shall.
Now, Ms. Brown, did you ever go swimming with Mr. Halderson in the Wisconsin River?
Yes.
Where did you guys go?
We went to Sauk City to a beach area on the river, right on the riverbank.
So they're just gonna say this is an area that you frequented.
No, we found it one day as a group, us and our friends, and we all went together for the first time.
Same area that they found
2020.
Krista. Same area they found Mom.
Yes, both.
How do you recognize them?
Chandler sent them to me.
And do you know anything about where these were taken or any of the circumstances around?
He just said a beach day in Sauk City with the boys.
Just quickly, Your Honor, if I can help them out. And these are pictures of the jury as already seen today. Show what we were talking about, 123.
Girl.
You provided those photos to police in connection with this investigation. Is that fair?
Yes.
Ms. Brown, what, if anything, do
Okay,
you
we
know
all
about,
pick bad guys
Chandler's
sometimes.
scuba diving career?
I don't know anything other than he told me that he has gone diving, that he was certified, and that he had a job diving
And did he say
And
what
that
department
he's a
he
liar.
dived with?
for the Madison Police Department.
Thank you. No further questions.
Cross-examination?
No, thank you.
Nope.
This witness be excused and released.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you so much. Have a good remainder of your day.
Take off page 1.
Who? Oh.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
If you are comfortable and believe you can safely and responsibly testify without wearing a mask, that would be our preference. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good afternoon. Could you please spell your name?
Okay.
Paige Valenta, P-A-I-G-E, Valenta, V-A-L-E-N-T-A,
And how are you employed?
with the City of Madison Police Department.
In what role?
I'm the Assistant Chief of Operations.
In the realm of ranks of police officers, you're near the very top.
I report directly to the chief.
I asked you a couple of questions in this case, which is why you're testifying, but does the Madison Police have a scuba diving rescue team?
No,
Has someone named Chandler Halderson ever been employed by the Madison Police to your knowledge?
no.
No further questions.
Cross-examination?
No, thank you.
May this
That's
be excused
it. That's all you brought her here for? You already asked her those questions. So you just brought her back. Just say it again. Just to nail it home that he is a lying liar that lies. Yes.
Just gonna get situated. Give me 1 second.
He's a lying liar who lies.
Detective, we've heard from you a couple of times. Due to some things you've done in this investigation, be fair to say that there was a large team of people responsible for determining what actions were taken, what steps to take next in the investigation. Or was it just you or just Sabrina Sims?
No, Detective Sims and I were the lead detectives, but we had a lot of help.
Sure. We have seen a lot of evidence in this case, both at all the crime scenes. Was it important to you to see if any of those items were connected to other crime scenes in this case?
Yes, definitely.
Why was that important?
It was important. We found tools out at the farm, obviously. We knew that there were items in the Halderson household that had been located. Trying to figure out how they're placed in the different locations, I guess. So the tools out at the farm, if there was anything that we could do to determine whether they had a tie directly to the Halderson family or the Halderson household was important.
And were there some steps taken in this investigation to try to make those determinations?
Definitely.
Some of them involved just seeing things and some involved expert witnesses.
Correct.
All right. Let's start with one item we've talked about a lot. It's marked, show the fence real quick. It's marked as exhibit 561 in this case. What is exhibit number 561?
I don't know.
It's
You
gonna
tell
be
me.
the Target bag filled with rags and cleaning supplies that Detective Feeney found on Erlen Road.
And these were the rags with the red stain on it, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And they were securely placed in evidence, and this has been sitting in the Dane County Sheriff's Office evidence for since they were collected and up until court.
Yes.
Okay, I'll move 561 into evidence.
No objection.
It is received.
Those items, or at least that bag, had a sticker on it with a name, right?
Yes.
And what name was that?
It was C. Melander.
And in the course of the investigation, did you have an idea of where that bag was last known to be?
Yes, we had found several bags similar with the same barcode with the same name on it at the Halderson residence.
So that's an example of one item found at the Irwin Road property connecting to the Halderson residence.
She
Yes.
did the pickup. Oh, poopers.
Let's talk about the gun. There was a gun found at the Irwin Road,
Let's talk about it.
Correct.
and that was in October.
I believe it was October, yes.
Were there any items in the
October.
home that drew your suspicion or that you wanted to examine whether those items were in some way connected to that gun?
Yes, during the search of the Halderson home, 3 magazines were located that were consistent with rifle magazines that would fit into the SKS rifle found on Irwin Road. We had also located a spent shell casing or a fired shell casing, another way of saying it, in the home.
Was there anything else located in the home that led you to believe that that gun was fired there?
There was metal fragments located on the north side of the basement.
Let's talk a little bit about the, start with the shell casing itself, or the spent casing. Is that last hollow bullet that everyone's seen?
Yes.
Why is that important to the investigation, or what drew your investigatory interest into that object?
Not normal to have a spent shell casing in a basement, especially within the proximity to the bullet fragments that were located nearby. At that point, we had already known that Bart Halderson had died of bullet wounds to the back. So obviously, tying all that together, made it more interesting.
Did the team engage an expert to try to analyze whether that gun fired the spent shell casing, fired that bullet?
Yes, and we'll hear from that expert
Today, in fact, right?
today, in fact, yes.
The gun, you mentioned that the magazines found in the wall, you believe matched the SKS rifle found at the barn.
They do.
And are you familiar with this gun?
I am.
How familiar are you with this gun?
I would say
Very.
very. I'm a firearms instructor and have quite a bit of experience with the SKS.
Was there any other gun found at the Halderson house that would fit those magazines?
No,
In fact, were there any other firearms recovered at the Halderson house, actual firearms?
not a real firearm.
There were some airsoft guns and things like that.
Correct, under Chandler's bed.
You used the phrase metal fragments, and I think you maybe use it a different way. Did you have a suspicion of what those metal fragments were?
Yes, they appear to be bullet fragments.
What made you to believe that?
The consistency, like I said, being a firearms instructor, I've seen plenty of bullet fragments laying around on the range. I've been involved with numerous death investigations, which included firearm trauma, finding these similar bullet fragments around. We also had pictures, photographs from the medical examiner's office that had these similar metal fragments, bullet fragments inside Mr. Halderson's torso.
Relative to the size of the bullet is in this gun that you say you're familiar with, how were these fragments big, small, a large portion of the bullet, small portion of the bullet? What would you say?
I would say small. The bullet's fragmented pretty widely,
And fragmented just means shattered.
broken to several pieces.
How
This
does that happen?
bullet fragment was photographed, correct?
Correct.
And I think we've seen some of the photographs. We have another one I've marked 557, just because we're going to talk about
You
it.
might have said that.
What's
I
557?
don't know how.
557 is the bullet fragment that was located on the north side of the basement in the Halderson home.
And the jury's seen this picture, but this is zoomed in, is it?
This is zoomed in, correct.
And who performed that work?
Deputy Scott Coons,
Who we heard from for about 4 hours the other day?
quite a while.
Okay, I'll move 557 into evidence.
It is received.
In the zoomed in version of 557, was anything drawing your attention when you saw this zoomed in or when you looked at this closely before it was washed by the crime lab?
Yeah, several things drew my attention. First, it appears to be the inner portion of the bullet, the projectile of a round. I didn't see any of the brass or copper casing that would be on the outside of it. I also observed quite a bit of reddish brown staining. It's not the best in this picture on the Elmo, but it's visibly there.
And when you say the staining, and I'll use my pen, are you talking about this area?
Yes, there's splatters all over.
And we heard about the DNA analyst who said that this was washed essentially and tested?
Correct.
Okay. You talked a little bit about not seeing any of the brass in the casing. Some people are more familiar with firearms than others. What do you mean by that?
So around the lead portion of a bullet would be some type of a casing, whether it be copper, most common. It just kind of holds the lead intact until it were to hit an object and expand. Typically, the copper will break away from the lead portion. Sometimes you can recover it, sometimes you cannot. This appears just to be the inner portion of that bullet.
Got it. You didn't see any of that casing?
I did not.
Okay. So when we talk about connections between Oak Springs and Irwin Road, you said that you had the spent casing tested for ballistics.
Correct.
Was the ammunition that was found in Mr. Halderson's bedroom, that big box that Mr. Selzner just held up, was that consistent with ammunition that would be fired out of that gun that was found out of the barn?
Yes, the SKS is a 7.62 by 39 caliber, and that was what the ammunition was that was located.
And in obvious case, you've looked at the other pieces of ammunition, including that bullet given Halderson that said, well, are all of those consistent with ammunition that could be fired out of that SKS rifle found out at the barn?
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about other items where we're talking about connections. Was there on Bart Halderson's torso, was there any sort of rope?
Yes, when Bart's torso was located, there was a section of rope that was wrapped around his waist.
Still the
And I
rope.
think everyone's seen that enough, but it was around the waist of Mr. Halderson?
Correct.
Was it tied into a knot?
If I recall, yes.
Was a similar style or colored rope found at the Halderson house in the search of the garage?
Yes, it was located in a basket in a garage.
And I think we already saw 210, but that's some black rope there.
Yes, it is.
Was a cutting of the rope found in the garage and then the rope found around Mr. Halderson's torso, was that sent out to the crime lab?
We did send it out for a fracture match.
Okay. Fracture match, meaning can someone actually say it's the exact same?
Whether they were once joined together.
The rope that was around Mr. Halderson's torso, we haven't seen it in court, was collected by the police?
Yes, we did collect it and we have it in evidence.
Why isn't it here?
The rope is double bagged due to the level of decomposition on the torso. It just wouldn't be appropriate to bring it into a closed setting such as this.
Is it refrigerated?
Yeah, I don't recall.
Is there a smell to it?
Definitely.
Oh, God.
In talking about other connections maybe present between the farm and the house, let's talk about some of the tools. There was what's been described as a keyhole saw, a hand saw found in an oil tank. I think we've all seen the photographs near Mr. Halderson's body. Was that tool collected?
The always saw was collected. All the tools inside that fuel drum were collected.
And you just said the brand name, Alway. Had you ever heard of this brand name before this case?
I had not.
Did it stick out to you for any particular reason?
It appeared to be a very old saw. We actually performed a Google search on it, and it was an antique saw.
Is it a brand that you normally see yourself?
I have never seen one before.
Showing you what's been received in evidence is exhibit number 221. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Where was this photograph taken and where's it from?
This photograph was one of the lower drawers in the Craftsman toolbox inside the Halderson's garage.
So showing everyone
See,
221.
dipshit didn't even know where the good tools were,
My finger is.
probably.
That silver handle right there, is that a saw?
Because he's probably never
Yes.
done anything
Yeah,
for
it's more
himself.
That's also an always saw. The handle is a little bit different in design than the one we located out at Rowan Road. However, it's still the same name brand.
He's never had to do a goddamn
The
thing
other
for
item
himself
that I
in
think
his
anthropologists
life.
talk a lot about today was that broken hacksaw blade. You've seen that in the course of the investigation?
The bow saw blade, yes,
In fact, I think you're the one who held it up for the jury a couple days ago.
unfortunately.
Might have been a
And
week.
then, with mommy and daddy gone, he didn't know how to clean up his own goddamn
Found in the
mess.
garage of the Halderson house that seemed consistent with you, that a frame that would hold that blade.
Jesus.
Yes, there was along the west wall behind. some
That's why
boards.
he
Bunch
had
of
to
boards.
get the
Showing
girlfriend
224,
involved.
these are already received in evidence. And 225, is that frame?
Yes, it is.
Show these to the jury so we're all looking at the same thing. Again, we've seen these all before, but 224, is that bow saw frame behind some boards?
Yes, it is.
And 225, that's maybe the end of the bow saw or where the blade attaches to the frame.
Correct. It's opposite of the handle side.
There's a little piece right there that's broken. Was that of interest to you?
Yes, it was. Knowing on Rowan Road that we had found the broken bow saw blade, we knew that there had to have been the other end that would attach to the saw somewhere. We also sent that portion along with the broken bow saw blade out for examination.
And someone to look at, see whether they matched or not.
Yes,
Okay. And we'll hear from that person today.
we will.
Let's talk about the tarps. A couple tarps found out at the Irwin Road property, one in the barn and one out by the torso, right?
Correct.
And
Technically,
so if
we've
we're
already
remembering
watched
everything right
that
from
one.
last week, Exhibit 174, this is a garbage can with a tarp in it.
Yes.
As it was essentially found with the garbage can.
Correct.
Is this the tarp that has some yellow tape on it?
Yes.
And then there is this big bag. I think the lab labeled it item S, but this is the barn tarp, right? This is labeled exhibit number 143.
That was the one found in the barn.
Okay, let's start with the one in the garbage can. Did that tarp appear to be newer to you?
It did.
You've seen in this case the person from Fleet Farm testify about the tarp that Mr. Halderson purchased on July 2nd. You've seen in the crime lab measuring it. You've actually seen the tarp. Is that tarp consistent with the tarp that was purchased at Fleet Farm by Mr. Halderson on July 2nd?
Yes, it is.
In size and color?
Yes, the crime lab reported that the tarp was 6 foot by 8 foot. It's silver and black. I've seen that in pictures, and I know that the the Fleet Farm tarp was definitely of those dimensions and same color.
Was in the search of the Halderson home any other tarp collected at the house that would be consistent with that Fleet Farm?
There was not.
No. This tarp that we're talking about, there was some testing that was done on it, correct?
Yes,
Is there something called footwear testing done?
there was a footwear analysis, and we'll hear about that later also.
In general, what is that analysis?
They're able to determine if there's any footwear impressions on the piece, in this instance the tarp, and then once they're able to identify whether there's footwear impressions on that tarp, they request.
Excuse
they're
me.
able to tell you what type of shoe they believe it is, and then they'll go on from there and can confirm whether or not a certain shoe made that impression. But like I said, we'll hear about that from an expert.
Same question with the tape. Was testing done on the tape that was found on the tarp?
Yes,
Was that yellow tape of evidentiary interest to you as a detective in this case?
yes, it was.
Why?
Several reasons. I know that we had located a roll of yellow duct tape in the south side section of the basement at the Halderson home. Also with tape, I know that fingerprints can be captured on there. From photos, I knew that there had been some red staining on the tape also, so possibly some DNA evidence.
It was an item of interest.
Of course.
Then briefly we'll talk about the barn tarp. In relationship to the tarp that's in the garbage can, is the barn tarp older or newer in your just general appearance?
It appeared older.
And in this case, were you able to discover any evidence that that tarp had been used before?
Yes, we have several photographs of Bart Halderson in his garage making a table on that what appeared to be that same tarp. It's a much larger tarp.
Okay. Less evidentiary interest because you thought maybe other people had been on this tarp. So the testing was done and we did it, right?
Yeah.
And
There was.
Oh, oh dear. Oh damn. No more questions.
No further
No
questions.
cross.
Cross-examination at this time.
Nothing now, thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Okay, so what we did was this video was done post the first video, but this video comes second. So if anything was confused or, you know, what have you, that's why. But I'll make this the first video and the other one the second video, because this comes before that one. But that's not how it is portrayed in the listing on the other playlist. So anyway, hopefully day 9 goes better. But day 9 should be the last day. And then we have closings. And we should be over. So there's that. So, recap. What did we hear? We heard from the anthropologist who said they were cut up. We heard that they were burnt. They found bone in the fireplace. They found bones. And she did the things with the start-stop things, and she could tell what saws were used. Well, not exactly what saws, but they could be consistent with the ones that they found, which is good enough for me. Because I don't know who else is coming into the house and using the saws when, no, it doesn't make any sense. There's no other plausible defense or no other plausible story. You're not giving me no other story. Chandler's story doesn't make any sense. There's no story. They left with somebody that you don't know. That's not plausible. That's not what they do. That's not their MO. They don't leave without telling people where they're going. Especially not you, bro. She would have left you food. She would have left you something. She wouldn't have just left you because you're a big fat fucking baby, and she wouldn't have just left you there. So that's bullshit. Yeah. So anyhow. So yeah, that's that one. Okay. Well, we will move right along to day 9. And day 9, let me, day 9, that is not my playlist. Come on now. What's wrong with you? You're in there. Get off. It's green. Here's the bag. That's what I said. No, that's not what I said. Okay. Go to my playlist for this. Okay. We can put that to the bottom. To the bottom. Oh my God, excuse me. I'm so sorry. So it will be 1, 2, 3. So it's about 4 hours. So it's got like this 1 4-hour long video, or it's got it broke up like it's been doing. I don't know. I'll have to take a look at it and see if it's the exact same things or if it's got it split up like that. And then day 10 is jury instructions, and then closing by by prosecution and defense. And then rebuttal by prosecution. And then we will do the verdict as well. So there's how that's gonna go. All right, well, I will end this now, and then I will get started on the next one for day 9. Okay, later.